The vanished graves. Why are the royal tombs missing? It is one of the quiet, gnawing mysteries of the English landscape. If you walk the burning sands of Egypt, you find the Valley of the Kings, vast monuments defying eternity. If you travel to the grand cathedrals of France, the stone effigies of monarchs lie in serene, well-documented repose. But in England, for the men who forged the very concept of England, there is largely silence. Where is the body of Hengist? Where does Offa of Mercia rest? Their bones have been scattered by time, by the violent churning of the earth, and by the indifference of the centuries that followed. We are left not with mausoleums, but with echoes, fragments of poetry, and the rusted iron of swords found in muddy fields. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead and let me know where you are in the world right now, and what time it is on your watch. Let us drift back, then, to a time when the map was blank and the edges of the world were defined by fog. We are stepping into the ruins of a fallen empire. The year is roughly 410 AD. For 4 centuries, the island of Britannia had been a province of Rome. It had heated floors, straight roads, wine from the Mediterranean, and the heavy, reassuring tramp of the legions. But the heart of the empire was rotting. Rome was burning, beset by Goths and Vandals, and the order went out to the edges of the world. Come home. The legions packed their kits, polished their eagles, and marched away, leaving the Britons gazing at the empty horizon. It must have felt like the lights going out in a vast, sprawling house. The Britons were suddenly alone. They were Romanized citizens, used to the protection of the state, now left to fend for themselves against the wolves at the door. And the wolves were hungry. From the north came the Picts, painted warriors climbing over Hadrian's wall. From the west, the Irish raiders. Desperate, the Britons sent a letter to Rome, a pathetic weeping document known to history as the Groans of the Britons. It begged for help. The reply was cold and bureaucratic. Look to your own defenses. Enter a man named Vortigern. In the mid-5th century, he was a tyrant or a high king of the Britons. History is fuzzy on his exact title, but clear on his catastrophic judgment. Vortigern had a problem. He was being attacked on all sides. He came up with a solution that sounds clever on paper, but usually ends in disaster in practice. He decided to hire mercenaries. He looked across the grey, heaving expanse of the North Sea, toward the marshy lowlands of what is now Germany and Denmark. He saw harsh men there, warriors who worshipped storm gods and treated war as a form of currency. He invited them in. This is the moment the key turns in the lock. This is the Adventus Saxonum, the coming of the Saxons. Tradition, blended with the misty half-truths of legend, tells us they arrived in 3 ships, just 3 long wooden keels slicing through the surf at Ebbsfleet in Kent. Standing at the prow were 2 brothers, Hengist and Horsa. Their names are wonderfully, suspiciously literal. Hengist means stallion, and Horsa means horse. It suggests that perhaps these weren't their birth names, but totemic titles. Or perhaps they are purely mythological figures representing the horse-worshipping culture of the Germanic tribes. But for our story, let's treat them as flesh and blood. Big men, with hair the color of straw and eyes like chips of flint, stepping onto the shingle of a British beach, looking at the soft green land with hunger. Vortigern offered them a deal: land in the Isle of Thanet and regular supplies of food in exchange for fighting off the Picts. It's the classic protection racket. And for a while, it worked. The Saxon brothers and their war bands marched north, their iron axes making short work of the Pictish raiders. Vortigern must have patted himself on the back, sipping his wine in a draughty Roman villa, thinking he had managed the situation perfectly. But mercenaries are expensive, and gratitude has a short shelf life. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that great, brooding diary of the English people written centuries later, tells us what happened with a terrifying simplicity. The Saxons sent word back home. They told their cousins in Germany about the worthlessness of the Britons and the richness of the land. It was a real estate brochure, written in blood. More ships came, not 3 this time, but fleets. They brought Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, distinct tribes that would eventually blend into the English. They brought their wives, their cattle, their pottery, and their gods. Woden, the one-eyed wanderer; Thunor, the hammer-wielder. The Isle of Thanet became too small. The food supplies from the Britons dried up or were deemed insufficient. The brothers, Hengist and Horsa, stopped being employees and started being conquerors. The conflict that followed was not a single battle, but a slow, grinding apocalypse. The Romano-British civilization, with its fading Latin and its crumbling brickwork, was smashed against the shield wall of the Germanic newcomers. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, but dripping with the mood of the era, called the Night of the Long Knives. It is said that Hengist invited the British nobles to a peace conference, a feast to smooth over their differences. The Saxons were told to hide their seaxes, long, single-edged fighting knives, inside their boots. At the signal, usually shouted as "Nimat eure seaxes," take out your knives. The feasting stopped, and the slaughter began. Most of the British leadership was wiped out between courses. Whether that specific dinner party happened or not, the result was the same. The Britons were pushed back. They fled to the west, to the mountains of Wales and the craggy peninsula of Cornwall, taking their language and their memories of Rome with them. The east of Britain was transformed. Horsa was killed in battle fairly early on, leaving Hengist as the sole patriarch of this new kingdom in Kent. He becomes the first Anglo-Saxon king in Britain, the founder of the Oisingas dynasty. But imagine the landscape he ruled. It wasn't a kingdom of castles and knights. It was a frontier. The great stone cities of Rome, London, Canterbury, Winchester, were largely abandoned. The Saxons didn't know how to live in them. They were farmers and woodworkers. To them, the Roman ruins were the work of giants, haunted places where ghosts walked on mosaic floors. They preferred to build their own halls of timber and thatch outside the ruined walls, letting the ivy strangle the marble columns. Hengist's reign is a time of shadow. We don't have his laws. We don't have his crown. We don't have his grave. He exists in the twilight between history and myth, a warlord who carved out a beachhead that would eventually swallow the island. When he died, around 488 AD, he didn't leave behind a unified nation. He left a fractured patchwork of tribal territories. This was the beginning of the Heptarchy, the rule of the 7 kingdoms. Slowly, out of the chaos of migration, distinct realms began to form. In the southeast, the Jutes settled Kent. In the south, the Saxons swarmed Sussex, Wessex, and Essex. In the north and east, the Angles created East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. It was a time of small kings and big feuds. Every valley had a lord. Every river was a border. The culture they brought with them was deeply fatalistic. They believed in word, fate. Weird bid, full a red, they would say. Fate is inexorable. You couldn't change it. You could only meet it standing up, sword in hand. Their kings claimed descent not from Roman emperors, but from Woden himself. This divine genealogy gave them the right to rule, the right to take, and the right to bleed. As the fires of the initial conquest burned down to embers, a new normal emerged. The Romano-British population wasn't entirely wiped out. Many were enslaved or absorbed, their DNA weaving into the Saxon stock. The language shifted. The melodious Celtic tongues and the sharp precision of Latin were drowned out by the guttural, earthy sounds of Old English. Place names changed. Londinium faded. The farmsteads of the Ingas and the Hams appeared. But it was a dark time for the soul. These new kings were pagans. They burned their dead, or buried them with grave goods for a grim afterlife. There were no monasteries copying texts, no grand libraries. The light of learning that Rome had kindled was extinguished, replaced by the flicker of the hearth fire in a warlord's mead hall. The poets, the Scops, would strum their lyres and sing of monsters and heroes, of Beowulf and dragon hordes, while the wind howled outside, rattling the wooden beams. Hengist's legacy was not a monument, but a people. He had opened the door, and they had flooded in. By the time his grandson took the throne in Kent, the connection to the German homeland was fading. They were no longer strangers in a strange land. They were becoming something else. They were becoming the English, but they were isolated, cut off from the Mediterranean world, cut off from the Christian God that Rome had adopted. They were a fierce, lonely outpost of paganism on the edge of the known world. The graves of these first kings are lost because they didn't build pyramids. They built earth mounds, barrows, that were easily plundered or plowed over by later generations. They returned to the soil that they had fought so hard to conquer. The mystery of the vanished graves isn't a conspiracy. It's a testament to the impermanence of that violent, shifting age. They slept in the earth, while above them the seasons turned, and the slow, quiet dawn of a new era began to creep over the horizon. The sword had done its work. Soon it would be time for the book. It was the year 597, and the wind blowing off the channel tasted of salt and change. By now, the chaotic scramble of the first invasions had settled into a kind of simmering armed truce. The map was drawn, and down in the southeast corner, in the kingdom of Kent, sat a man named Ethelbert. Ethelbert was not just a king. He was a Bretwalda, a Briton ruler. It's a title that implies a heavy brow and a heavier hand. He held dominion over the other southern kings, a first among equals in this violent new hierarchy. But Ethelbert had a domestic situation that was quietly undermining the pagan purity of his court. He had married a woman named Bertha. Bertha was a princess of the Franks. From across the water in what is now France, the Franks had already converted to Christianity. And when Bertha packed her trunks for England, she included a condition in the marriage contract. She would be allowed to practice her faith. So, for years, while Ethelbert sacrificed to Woden and poured libations for the thunder god, his wife was praying to Jesus in a small, renovated Roman chapel in Canterbury. It must have been a strange household. The king feasting in the mead hall with his warriors, boasting of battles, while the Queen whispered Latin prayers a few hundred yards away. It was a crack in the door, and through that crack, Rome was about to step back in. Pope Gregory the Great, sitting on the throne of St. Peter in a room that was a shadow of its former self, had a vision. Legend says he saw some fair-haired boys for sale in a slave market and asked who they were. Angles, he was told. Not angles, but angels, he quipped, a pun that surely sounds better in Latin. Angli said angeli. He decided it was time to reclaim this lost province for God. He didn't send legions this time. He sent monks. He chose a man named Augustine, not the famous theologian of Hippo, but a somewhat nervous administrator who really didn't want the job. Augustine and his party of 40 monks set out for the edge of the known world. They were terrified. To the Romans, the English were savages, heavy drinkers, and prone to chopping heads off. The monks actually stopped in France and tried to turn back, sending a letter to the Pope asking if they could please just come home. Gregory said no, keep walking. They landed, ironically, at the very same spot where Hengist and Horsa had beached their ships a century and a half earlier, the Isle of Thanet. But instead of axes, they carried a silver cross and a board painted with the image of Christ. Ethelbert heard they had arrived. He was a pragmatic man. He knew the power of Rome, even a fallen Rome. He agreed to meet them, but he set a very specific condition. The meeting had to take place outdoors, under the open sky. This wasn't because he enjoyed a picnic. It was spiritual self-defense. In the pagan Germanic mind, foreign magic was potent, and it worked best indoors, trapped under a roof. Ethelbert was afraid these strangers might cast a spell on him to steal his wits. If they were outside, the fresh air would dilute their wizardry. Picture the scene. The King of Kent, surrounded by his housecarls, big men with braided hair and scars, hands resting casually on sword hilts. And approaching them, a procession of men in rough wool robes chanting a litany in a strange, rhythmic language, carrying incense that curled into the grey English sky. It was the meeting of two worlds, the Iron Age colliding with the Mediterranean. Augustine preached. He didn't have a PowerPoint. He had a translator, likely one of Queen Bertha's Frankish chaplains, struggling to turn complex theology into the rough dialect of Old English. He spoke of a God who died and rose again, of eternal life, of a kingdom not of this world. Ethelbert listened. His response is recorded by the Venerable Bede, and it is a masterpiece of diplomatic caution. He said, essentially, "Your words are fair, but they are new and uncertain. I cannot just abandon the ancient customs of my people. However, you've come a long way, and you seem to mean well, so I won't kill you. In fact, I'll give you a house in Canterbury and enough food, and you can preach to whoever wants to listen." It was a soft opening, but the dominoes began to fall. Ethelbert watched these monks. He saw that they didn't drink themselves into a stupor. They didn't brawl, and they seemed genuinely happy to suffer for their beliefs. The power of example is a heavy thing. Eventually, the king stepped into the water. Ethelbert was baptized. When a king converts, the kingdom tilts. Thousands of his subjects followed him into the river to be baptized, likely more out of loyalty and a desire for job security than deep theological understanding. But the result was the same. The temples to Woden weren't torn down immediately. Pope Gregory, in a stroke of genius, advised Augustine to just sprinkle them with holy water and replaced the idols with altars. Do not destroy the shrines, he wrote. Destroy the error in their minds. It was a rebranding exercise. The midwinter feast of Yule became Christmas. The spring festival of the goddess Eostre became Easter. The old magic wasn't erased, it was layered over. But the arrival of Christianity brought something even more powerful than salvation. It brought the technology of writing. Before this, the Anglo-Saxons were an oral culture. Laws were remembered by elders. Stories were sung by bards. If you forgot it, it was gone. The monks brought the alphabet. They brought parchment, ink, and the codified rule of law. Ethelbert, inspired by what he saw of Roman administration, decided to write down the laws of Kent. This is a monumental moment. It is the first time the English language is written down for a statute. The laws of Ethelbert are fascinating because they are a bizarre hybrid of Christian morality and raw Germanic tribal custom. They are essentially a price list for injuries. The Saxons didn't use prisons. They used vergild, or man money. If you killed someone, you paid their family a certain amount of gold to stop them from killing you back. If you cut off a thumb, that costs this much. A big toe. That's expensive because you need it for balance in a shield wall. The very first law in Ethelbert's code reads, "The property of God and the church, 12-fold compensation." In one sentence, he placed the new church at the very top of the social hierarchy, above even the king himself. The church was now the most protected entity in the land. This period, the Kentish dawn, wasn't just about religion. It was about connection. England was plugging back into the mainframe of European civilization. Trade increased. Merchants from Gaul and Italy started showing up in Canterbury, bringing glass, wine, and ideas. The isolation of the pagan era was ending. But let's not pretend it was all chanting and incense. It was still a brutal time. Ethelbert might have been a Christian, but he was still a warlord who took hostages and demanded tribute. And the conversion wasn't universal. His own son, Edbald, was watching from the sidelines, unimpressed by this new turn the other cheek philosophy. When Ethelbert finally died in 616, after a reign of 56 years, an eternity in those days, the tension snapped back. Eadbald took the throne and immediately shocked the church by marrying his stepmother, not Bertha, but Ethelbert's second wife. This was a standard pagan practice to secure the dowry and legitimacy, but to the church, it was incest of the highest order. The Bishop of London had to flee. The Bishop of Rochester ran for the coast. It looked for a moment like the Christian experiment in England was going to be a short, failed chapter. There is a legend that the last remaining bishop, Lawrence, was packing his bags to leave Canterbury when St. Peter appeared to him in a dream and whipped him, scolding him for abandoning his flock. The next morning, Lawrence went to King Edbald, pulled down his robe, and showed him the fresh welts on his back. The king, terrified that a ghost could inflict physical damage, repented on the spot, put away his stepmother, and embraced the faith. Whether it was a miracle or a very clever bit of theatre by the bishop, the result was that Kent stayed Christian. The foothold was secure. But Kent was just one kingdom. To the north, in the wild heath-covered lands of East Anglia, another power was rising. A king there was watching the events in Kent with a jealous eye. He wanted the power of the new god, but he didn't want to let go of the old ones. His name was Raedwald, and he was about to leave us the greatest physical enigma in British history. As the sun set on Ethelbert's reign, the center of gravity began to shift northwards. The torch was passing from the civilized, Roman-influenced fields of Kent to the brooding, sea-battered coast of Suffolk. The age of the scribe was beginning, but the age of the warrior king was far from over. In fact, it was about to get much more golden and much more mysterious. If you travel northeast from Kent, up the curve of the coast, you enter the lands of the East Angles. It is a different kind of country, a landscape of flat fens, slow-moving rivers, and vast open skies that seem to press down on the earth. Here, in the early 7th century, a new dynasty was flexing its muscles. They called themselves the Wuffingas, the people of the wolf, a name that hints at a totemic, feral ancestry. And their king was a man named Radwald. Radwald is one of history's great hedgers. If Ethelbert of Kent was the CEO who fully embraced the corporate rebranding of Christianity, Radwald was the regional manager who nodded along in the meetings, but kept doing things his own way, back at the branch office. He had traveled to Kent and accepted baptism, likely bowing to the pressure of the older, more powerful Ethelbert. But when he returned home to East Anglia, he faced a domestic crisis. His wife, whose name, maddeningly, has been lost to history, though her influence clearly has not, was a staunch pagan. She scolded him for abandoning the gods of his fathers. So, Raedwald came up with a solution that is almost comically pragmatic. In his royal temple, he set up 2 altars. On one, he offered the bread and wine of the Christian Mass. On the other, right next to it, he sacrificed meat to the old demons. It was a spiritual insurance policy. No matter who won the cosmic war, Redwald intended to be on the winning side. It tells us so much about the mindset of the era. Religions weren't seen as mutually exclusive truths, but as technologies of power. Why use just one when you can use both? By the year 616, Ethelbert was dead, and the title of Bretwalda, the overlord of Britain, passed to Raedwald. For a brief, shining moment, East Anglia was the center of the universe. Raedwald marched his armies north and defeated the Northumbrians, installing his own puppet on their throne. He was the big man on campus. And when he died around 624 AD, his people decided to send him off in a manner that would echo through eternity. They didn't just dig a hole, they dragged a ship, a 90-foot-long, sea-going vessel made of oak, up from the river Debouche, hauling it over the heathland on rollers, sweating and cursing, until they reached a high ridge overlooking the River Deben. They dug a trench in the sand and lowered the ship into it. Inside the hull, they built a wooden chamber, a house for the dead. For 13 centuries, the wind blew over the heath. The grass grew and died. The location, known as Sutton Hoo, became just a cluster of odd, grassy bumps in the landscape. Rabbits burrowed into them. Sheep grazed on them. The name of Redwald was forgotten, his kingdom absorbed, his lineage extinguished. Then came the summer of 1939. The world was holding its breath, waiting for the Second World War to begin. On the estate of a woman named Edith Pretty, a self-taught local archaeologist named Basil Brown began to gently scrape away the soil of the largest mound. What he found changed everything we thought we knew about the Dark Ages. He didn't find the ship itself. The wood had long since rotted away in the acidic soil. What he found was a ghost. The timber had turned to black dust, but the iron rivets were still in place, suspended in the sand, preserving the exact shape of the clinker-built hull. It was a phantom vessel sailing through the earth, and in the center of that phantom ship lay the treasure of the Wufingas. The hall was staggering. This wasn't the grave of a barbarian chieftain who banged rocks together. This was the resting place of a sophisticated, wealthy, and cosmopolite monarch. Consider the helmet. You've likely seen it. The iconic face of the Anglo-Saxon age. It's made of iron, covered in tinned bronze sheets, with a mask that freezes a human face in a permanent stoic grimace. But look closer. The nose, eyebrows, and mustache form the image of a flying dragon. The eyebrows are capped with boars' heads made of garnet. It is a visual puzzle, a piece of art that is both terrifying and protective. It says, I am a man, but I am also a monster. I am a king, and I am a dragon. Then there is the gold. The great gold buckle is a heavy, solid slab of wealth, covered in writhing, interlaced snakes and beasts. The intricate knotwork is so fine, you almost need a magnifying glass to appreciate it. This is the work of master goldsmiths, men who had likely trained in the finest workshops of Europe or beyond. And that's the real shocker. The beyond. Inside this grave in a quiet corner of Suffolk, they found garnets that originated in Sri Lanka and India. They found silver bowls from Byzantium. They found bitumen from the Middle East. They found coins from Merovingian France. Redwald wasn't living in a mud hut in the middle of nowhere. He was at the center of a trade network that spanned the known world. He drank wine from the Mediterranean, wore gems from the Indian Ocean, and fought with Swedish-style weaponry. The discovery of Sutton Hoo single-handedly destroyed the idea that this period was dark. It was vibrant. It was colorful. It was filled with poetry and craftsmanship. These people loved riddles, they loved beauty, and they loved gold. The poem Beowulf, which was written down later but composed in this spirit, describes ship burials just like this one. For years, scholars thought Beowulf was just fantasy. Sutton Hoo proved that the poet was describing reality. They laid their dear lord, the giver of rings, deep within the ship. Imagine the funeral. It is dusk. Torches flicker against the grey sky. The king's body is laid out amidst his treasures, his sword with the gold pommel, his lyre for music in the afterlife, his cauldrons for feasting, a whetstone, the symbol of his authority, is placed near him. It is carved with faces and topped with a stag, a symbol of royal power. The people of the Wufingas stand around the rim of the pit. They are saying goodbye, not just to a man, but to an era of dominance. They slaughter animals and throw them in. Then they begin to shovel the sand, the sound of the earth hitting the wood of the burial chamber, the slow disappearance of the gold, the helmet, the ship. They built a mound over it, a false horizon, visible from the river so that passing ships would know a great king lay there. Redwald's ambiguity followed him into the grave. There were 2 silver spoons found in the burial, inscribed with the names Saulos and Paulus, Saul and Paul, a reference to the conversion of Saint Paul, a Christian token, or just expensive imported silverware that looked nice. We don't know. The body itself had dissolved entirely, the acidity of the soil, leaving no bone, only a stain. He is there, and he is not there. This burial was a high water mark for East Anglia. After Raedwald, the Wufingas slowly declined. They were swallowed up in the endless, churning wars between the greater kingdoms. The focus of history was about to shift again, away from the flatlands of the East, moving north to the rugged, craggy hills of Northumbria. But before we leave the graveside, pause for a moment on the psychology of it. Why bury this much wealth? It's an economic catastrophe to take the finest sword, the best helmet, and the most gold in the kingdom and bury it in the ground where no one can use it. It is a display of such supreme confidence, such arrogant abundance, that it serves as a weapon in itself. It says to potential rivals, "We have so much gold, we can afford to throw it away. Imagine what we can do to you." It was the last great pagan gesture. As the decades rolled on, kings would stop being buried with grave goods. Christianity taught that you couldn't take it with you. The gold would go to the church, to the poor, or to the royal treasury, not into the dirt. Sutton Hoo was the sunset of the heroic age, a final, blazing defiance against the dying of the light. The wind shifts. The Briton ruler is dead. The ship is buried. And far to the north, two rival dynasties are sharpening their knives, preparing to fight for the soul of England. The age of the Saint Kings is coming. We leave the sandy heathlands of Suffolk and the ghost ship of Raedwald to travel north, far north, past the Humber River, into a landscape that feels harder, sharper, and colder. This is Northumbria. If the south of England was a place of gentle hills and Roman ruins, Northumbria was a jagged frontier of wind-scoured moors and crashing grey waves. Here, the story of England stops being about gold in the ground and starts being about the fire in the mind. The kingdom of Northumbria was actually two kingdoms stitched together. Bernicia in the north, stretching up toward modern Scotland, and Dara in the south around York. They didn't like each other. The history of this region is a game of musical chairs played with swords, as rival dynasties murdered one another for control. But out of this blood-soaked soil grew something unexpectedly beautiful, a spiritual renaissance that would light up the Dark Ages. The protagonist of this act is a man named Oswald. Oswald's early life was the stuff of a gritty reboot. His father, a warlord of Bernicia, was killed by a rival, forcing Oswald into exile while he was just a boy. He didn't flee to the civilized courts of Europe. He fled west, into the mist-shrouded islands of the Hebrides, to the Irish kingdom of Dalriata. There, on the rocky island of Iona, he was taken in by monks. These weren't the Roman-style administrators we met in Kent. These were Celtic monks, wild, ascetic men who lived in beehive huts, stood in freezing water to pray, and found God in the raw violence of nature. Oswald grew up soaking in this Celtic Christianity. He learned to fight, yes. He was a Saxon prince, after all. But he also learned a different kind of kingship, one rooted in humility and service. When the usurper back home finally died, Oswald returned to claim his birthright. The year was 633. He faced a massive army led by a Welsh king, Cadwallon, who had been ravaging the north. The night before the battle, at a place called Heavenfield, Oswald did something theatrical. He didn't sacrifice a horse to Woden. He had his men dig a hole. He grabbed a massive wooden cross, held it upright with his own hands, while his soldiers backed the earth around it, and then knelt to pray. It was a calculated statement. I am fighting for a new power. The next morning, despite being outnumbered, Oswald's shield wall shattered the Welsh army. The exile was now king. But Oswald had a problem. His people were still largely pagan. He needed to convert them, but he didn't trust the Roman missionaries down south. Too soft, too bureaucratic. So he sent a message back to his old friends on Iona. Send me a bishop. The first guy they sent was a disaster, a stern, fire and brimstone preacher who yelled at the Northumbrians for being stubborn heathens. He went back to Iona, complaining that the English were unteachable. The monks sat around, discussing what to do. Then, a gentle voice spoke up from the back. It was a monk named Aidan. He suggested that perhaps the first bishop had been too harsh, that he should have offered the milk of gentleness before the meat of hard doctrine. The monks looked at him and said, "Congratulations, Aidan. You're the new bishop." Aidan traveled to Northumbria, but he didn't set up his headquarters in the old Roman capital of York. He chose a place that reflected his Celtic soul. Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne, or Holy Island, is a geological metaphor for the spiritual life. It is connected to the mainland by a tidal causeway. Twice a day, the tide rushes in, cutting the island off from the world, turning it into a sanctuary of sea and sky. Twice a day, the waters recede, allowing the monks to walk out into the world to preach. It breathes. The partnership between King Oswald and Bishop Aidan is one of the few genuinely heartwarming stories in this brutal era. Aidan didn't speak English well. He spoke Irish. Oswald, having spent his youth in exile, spoke fluent Irish. So, as they traveled the wild countryside, the king, the most powerful warlord in Britain, would stand beside the humble monk, translating the gospel for his rough-hewn earls and peasants. It's a striking image, the man with the sword serving as the voice for the man with the staff. Lindisfarne became a powerhouse. It wasn't just a monastery. It was an art school, a university, and a publishing house. The monks there began to produce manuscripts of breathtaking beauty. They took the swirling, geometric patterns of Celtic metalwork, the spirals and knots you see on shields and torques, and transferred them onto parchment to glorify the Word of God. This fusion of Irish art and Anglo-Saxon energy created the insular style, a visual language that is vibrant, chaotic, and incredibly disciplined. But in the 7th century, peace was always a temporary condition. Oswald, the warrior saint, eventually ran into the buzzsaw that was Benda of Mercia. More on him soon. At the Battle of Maserfield in 642, Oswald was killed. His body was ritualistically dismembered, head and arms put on spikes. It was a pagan trophy display, but to the Christians, it was martyrdom. A cult of St. Oswald sprang up instantly. His arm, it was said, would never rot. The soil where he fell was scooped up by peasants until a deep pit was formed, the dirt believed to cure sickness. With Oswald dead, the crown passed to his younger brother, Oswiu. If Oswald was the saint, Oswiu was the survivor. He was a pragmatist who had to hold the kingdom together with duct tape and ruthless political maneuvering. He even arranged the murder of a rival cousin, a saintly man named Oswin, which led to Oswiu's own wife refusing to sleep with him until he founded a monastery to atone for the sin. It was a messy, complicated reign. Oswiu faced a unique domestic headache that serves as a perfect microcosm for the era. The British Isles were effectively running two different operating systems for Christianity. The Celtic Church, based in Iona and Lindisfarne, did things one way. The Roman Church, based in Kent and Europe, did things another. The biggest flashpoint was the date of Easter. They used different lunar calendars to calculate it. This wasn't just an academic dispute. It was a logistical nightmare for the royal household. Oswiu followed the Celtic calendar of his brother. His queen, Ian fled, a princess from Kent, followed the Roman calendar. So, in some years, the king would be celebrating the feasting and joy of Easter Sunday, while the queen and her court were still in the grim fasting and penance of Palm Sunday. You can imagine the tension at the breakfast table. "Pass the bacon," says the king. "I can't. I'm fasting," glares the queen. To fix this, Oswiu called a meeting in 664 AD, the Synod of Whitby. It was the great showdown. The Celtic monks from Lindisfarne, with their weird tonsures, they shaved the front of their heads, ear to ear, looking a bit like mullets gone wrong, argued for tradition. Saint Columba did it this way. The Roman faction, led by a fiery, ambitious priest named Wilfrid, argued for universality. St. Peter, who holds the keys to heaven, did it this way. Do you think your handful of monks on a damp rock at the edge of the world are right, and the entire universal church is wrong? Oswiu sat in the middle, listening. He was a politician. He asked the Celtic bishop, Colman, "Is it true that Jesus gave the keys of the kingdom to Peter?" Colman admitted it was in the Bible. Oswiu smiled. "Then I will obey the doorkeeper, lest when I come to the gates of heaven, there is no one to open them for me." He ruled for Rome. It was a tectonic shift. The Celtic monks, heartbroken, packed up their relics and retreated back to Iona and Ireland. Lindisfarne remained, but it fell in line with the Roman order. England would not be a loose collection of independent Celtic churches. It would be part of the centralized, bureaucratic structure of Europe. But the spirit of Lindisfarne didn't die. In fact, the fusion got stronger. The discipline of Rome met the artistic genius of the Celts. A few decades later, a monk named Edfrith, working in the scriptorium on Holy Island, would pick up his quill and begin the Lindisfarne Gospels. If you look at the carpet pages of that book, you see the entire history of this period. You see the interlaced patterns of Germanic gold buckles, the spirals of Celtic stone carving, and the Latin text of the Roman Church, all woven together into a single, blindingly complex image. It is a page of order created out of chaos. The Northumbrian Golden Age was in full swing. They were producing saints like Cuthbert, a hermit who stood in the sea with otters drying his feet, and scholars like Bede, who would write the history of the English people. But while the monks were painting and the kings were debating theology, a storm was brewing in the Midlands. The old gods weren't done yet. They had one last, terrifying champion, a man who had no time for crosses or tonsures, a man who simply wanted to conquer. We descend now from the wind-battered cliffs of the north into the dense, muddy heart of the island. This is the Midlands. In the 7th century, this wasn't a land of industrial cities or quaint canals. It was a sprawling, untamed frontier known as Mercia. The name itself, Myers, means the border people. It was the jagged edge where the Saxon invaders bumped up against the retreating Welsh kingdoms in the west and the established English kingdoms in the east. It was a place where life was hard, borders were fluid, and the sword was the only law that mattered. And ruling this hard country was a man who stands out like a granite boulder in a stream of holy water. Penda. Penda is the great anti-hero of the Anglo-Saxon saga. To the monks writing the history books, particularly our friend Bede up in Northumbria, Penda was the boogeyman. He was the heathen wolf, the destroyer of saints, the last terrifying gasp of the old pagan order. But if you strip away the monastic propaganda, you find something even more interesting. You find a warrior of immense capability, a king who ruled not by divine right or holy oil, but by the sheer, undeniable force of his personality. He was a pagan, yes. He worshipped Woden, the god of war and wisdom, and likely saw the Christian god as just another tribal deity, and a soft one at that. But Penda wasn't a fanatic. He didn't burn churches just for the fun of it. In fact, he famously allowed Christian missionaries to preach in his lands, provided they actually lived up to their words. He is recorded as saying he despised those whom he saw not performing the works of faith they had received. In other words, he hated hypocrites. If you're going to worship a God of peace and charity, you better act like it. If not, Penda had an axe with your name on it. His reign was defined by his relentless dismantling of Northumbrian power. Remember Edwin, the powerful king of Northumbria? Penda teamed up with the Welsh king Cadwallon, a Christian, proving that politics always trumps religion, and smashed Edwin's army at Hatfield Chase in 633. Edwin was killed. Then came Oswald, the Saint King who raised the cross at Heavenfield. Penda marched north again. At the Battle of Maserfield in 642, the old pagan crushed the young saint. Oswald was hacked to pieces, his limbs mounted on stakes as an offering to Woden. It was brutal, old-school psychological warfare. For a moment, it looked like Christianity in England might be strangled in its cradle. Penda was undefeated. He had killed 2 Bretwaldas. He was the kingmaker and the kingbreaker. By the 650s, Penda was an old man, perhaps in his 70s, a staggering age for a warrior in this era. He had accumulated a massive amount of tribute, loot, known as the Penda Hoard, we can imagine, and he held the southern English kingdoms in a grip of iron. But the Northumbrians, now led by Oswald's brother Oswiu, were still a thorn in his side. In 655, Penda decided to finish the job. He assembled a massive coalition. He called in favors from 30 sub-kings, including princes from East Anglia and Wales. It was the Great Heathen Army, before the Vikings ever thought of the name. They marched north, trapping Oswiu in his fortress, likely near Stirling. Oswiu was desperate. He offered Penda a treasure hoard so vast it was legendary. Bags of gold, jewels, the works, just to go away. The accounts differ here. Some say Penda took the gold and attacked anyway. Others say he refused it, intent on exterminating the Northumbrian line entirely. Either way, the armies met at a place called the Winwade. We don't know exactly where it is today, possibly near Leeds, but we know the weather was apocalyptic. It was November. Heavy rains had turned the river into a raging torrent. The battle was a disaster for the Mercians. Perhaps the coalition fractured. There are rumors of betrayal, of allies marching away in the night. But the old wolf, Penda, fought on. He was finally cut down, not by a single champion, but by the chaos of the rout. The chronicle tells us that more were drowned in the flight than destroyed by the sword. The river rose up and swallowed the last great pagan army. Penda, the man who had lived by the sword, died in the mud, his body lost to the floodwaters. With Penda's death, the dam broke. The last obstacle to the total Christianization of England was gone. But ironically, Penda's death didn't destroy Mercia, it unleashed it. Penda's son, Wulfhere, emerged from the wreckage. He had been kept in hiding, but soon the Mercian nobles rebelled against the Northumbrian occupation and put Wulfhere on the throne. And here is the twist. Wulfhere became a Christian. the son of the ultimate pagan warlord, became the first Christian king of all Mercia. This ushered in the era of Mercian supremacy. For the next century, the center of gravity in England wasn't in the north or the south, but right in the middle. The Mercians were aggressive, expansionist, and incredibly wealthy. They swallowed up smaller tribes, the Huiche, the Magunsaite, the Lindsay. All these minor kingdoms became provinces of Greater Mercia. The Mercian kings didn't have the scholarly, saintly vibe of the Northumbrians. They were more secular, more administrative. They were interested in power, taxation, and infrastructure. They began to issue silver coins in massive quantities, the sceattas, heavily debased little slugs of silver that greased the wheels of trade from the Rhineland to the Irish Sea. But the most fascinating aspect of this period is the tribal hidage. It's a document that has survived from the Mercian era, and it is essentially a tax assessment list. It lists 35 different tribes and how much land they occupied, measured in hides, the amount of land needed to support one family. It gives us a snapshot of an England that was still a patchwork quilt of distinct identities. The dwellers in the peak, the Elmet dwellers, the men of the Chilterns. The Mercian kings looked at this quilt and said, "We will stitch this into a blanket, and we will wrap it around ourselves." Wulfhere and his successors, kings like Ethelbald, dominated the landscape. Ethelbald, who ruled for 41 years in the early 8th century, styled himself King of Britain. He was so powerful that the church began to get nervous. Saint Boniface, writing from Germany, sent Ethelbald a blistering letter. He praised the king's generosity and his protection of the poor, but then pivoted to say, essentially, stop sleeping with nuns. Apparently, Ethelbald and his nobles were treating convents as royal harems. It shows the tension between the warrior aristocracy and the church. The kings wanted the prestige of the religion, but they struggled with the morality. Ethelbald eventually met a sticky end, murdered by his own bodyguards at night, a grim reminder that in Mercia, loyalty was only as good as your last payout. But his death cleared the stage for the greatest of them all, a man who would take the raw, brute force of Benda and the administrative ambition of Wulfhere and refine it into true imperialism. As we leave the era of Benda, we leave behind the age of heroes and enter the age of statesmen. The mud of the Windwade has dried. The old gods have retreated into the folklore of the deep woods. The cross is everywhere now, but the ambition to rule, to control, to draw lines on a map, that hasn't changed. In fact, it's about to get much more literal. A ditch is coming. A very, very big ditch. The year is 757. Ethelbald, the king of Mercia, is dead, stabbed in the dark by his own guards at Seckington. The realm teeters on the edge of anarchy. A civil war flares up, brief and bloody, like a match struck in a dark room. And when the smoke clears, a man named Offa is standing holding the crown. Offa is the colossus of the Anglo-Saxon age. Before him, kings were tribal leaders. After him, they were monarchs. He didn't just rule Mercia, he swallowed the surrounding kingdoms whole. Kent, Sussex, East Anglia, they all became provinces of his vast Midland Empire. But Offa's vision extended far beyond the muddy fields of England. He looked across the channel to the glittering court of the Franks, where a man named Charlemagne, Charles the Great, was rebuilding the Roman Empire in all but name. Offa looked at Charlemagne and didn't see a superior. He saw a mirror. There is a fascinating correspondence between these two giants. They wrote letters to each other, calling one another dearest brother. It was a diplomatic bromance, but one fraught with tension. Charlemagne was the most powerful man in Europe, ruler of a domain that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube. He was used to lesser kings bowing and scraping. Offa didn't bow. At one point, they tried to arrange a marriage. Charlemagne proposed that his son marry Offa's daughter. Offa agreed, but on one condition. His own son, Ecgfrith, must marry Charlemagne's daughter, Bertha. Charlemagne was outraged. The idea that a barbarian king from a rainy island would demand a Frankish princess was an insult. He broke off all trade relations. The ports were closed. The wine stopped flowing to England. The wool cloaks stopped flowing to France. It was a medieval trade war. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed, mostly because the holy men on both sides needed their supplies, and trade resumed. But the incident shows us Offa's ego. He saw himself as Rex Anglorum, King of the English, a title he used broadly and boldly. He even convinced the Pope to create a new archbishopric at Lichfield, right in the heart of Mercia, just so he wouldn't have to rely on the Archbishop of Canterbury in rebellious Kent. He was redesigning the spiritual geography of the island to suit his political needs. Offa understood the power of branding. He revolutionized the currency. Before Offa, money was a chaotic mix of foreign coins and rough silver slugs. Offa introduced the silver penny, a high-quality, standardized coin stamped with his name and portrait. It was a masterpiece of propaganda. Every time a merchant in a market bought a sheep or a barrel of ale, they held the king's face in their hand. And then there is the gold dinar. In the British Museum, there sits a coin that boggles the mind. It is made of gold, and on one side, it has the Latin inscription Offa Rex. On the other side, it is covered in Arabic script, copying a dinar from the Caliph al-Mansur, proclaiming, "There is no God but Allah." Why would a Christian king of Mercia strike a coin praising Allah? Was he a secret convert? Almost certainly not. It's far more likely that Offa, the pragmatist, realized that the gold dinar was the dollar of the Middle Ages, the universally accepted currency of Mediterranean trade. He was copying it so his merchants could do business in Europe and beyond. The fact that the engraver copied the Arabic text upside down suggests they had no idea what it meant. They just knew it looked like money. It's a hilarious human detail. A king trying to look cosmopolitan and getting the label upside down. But Offa's ambition wasn't limited to gold. He wanted to leave a mark on the earth itself. He looked to the west, to the rugged, misty hills of Wales. The Welsh kingdoms, Powys, Gwent, Gwynedd, were a constant headache. They raided the fertile Mercian valleys, vanishing back into the mountains before they could be caught. Offa decided he couldn't conquer the mountains, so he would wall them off. He ordered the construction of the dike. Offa's dike is the largest construction project in Britain between the fall of Rome and the building of the Norman castles. It is a massive earthwork, a ditch and a rampart, running roughly 176 miles from the Severn estuary in the south to the Dee estuary in the north. Imagine the mobilization required. This wasn't built by slaves. It was built by the feared, the levy of free men. Thousands of laborers moving millions of tons of soil with wooden shovels and wicker baskets. They cleared forests. They cut through bedrock. It wasn't a defensive wall like Hadrian's Wall. It didn't have stone forts every mile. It was a demarcation line, a political statement carved into the crust of the planet. It said, "To the east is Mercia, land of law, order, and English speech. To the west is Wales, the land of the foreigners." It forced travelers to pass through designated gateways, where tolls could be collected and names taken. It was border control in the 8th century. Walking the dike today, you can still feel the ghost of that authority. In some places, the bank is still 12 feet high, looming over the Welsh side, giving the Mercian defenders the high ground. It follows the contours of the hills with a strategic brilliance, always offering a clear line of sight to the west. It effectively ended the fluid frontier. It created Wales and England as distinct physical entities. Before the dike, there were just people fighting. After the dike, there were nations. But for all his grandeur, Offa's legacy has a tragic aftertaste. He was obsessed with succession. He wanted to ensure his dynasty would last 1,000 years. He had his son, Ecgfrith, crowned king while Offa was still alive. A unique ceremony in Anglo-Saxon history, mimicking the Frankish custom. He purged rivals, executed anyone with a drop of royal blood who might challenge his boy. He cleared the board. It backfired spectacularly. When Offa died in 796, peacefully in his bed, Ecgfrith took the throne. He ruled for exactly 141 days. He died suddenly, perhaps of natural causes, perhaps of poison. Because Offa had killed so many potential heirs to secure Ecgfrith's path, there was no one left to take up the mantle of the direct line. The dynasty imploded. A distant relative named Coenwulf took over. But the magic was gone. The Mercian supremacy trundled on for a few more decades. But the momentum was lost. And while Offa was busy building his wall against the Welsh and arguing with Charlemagne, he missed the real threat. It wasn't coming from the west, and it wasn't coming from the south. It was coming from the sea. In 789, a few years before Offa's death, the Reeve, a local official of Dorchester, was going about his business on the coast of Wessex. He saw 3 strange ships land. They were sleek, low in the water, with dragon heads carved on the prows. The Reeve, a dutiful civil servant, rowed down to the beach. He assumed they were traders. He told them they needed to come to the royal ville to pay their taxes on whatever goods they were selling. The men on the ships didn't pay taxes. They drew their swords and killed him. It was the first drop of rain before the hurricane. Offa had built a dike to keep out the Welsh, but he had left the back door open. The Vikings had arrived. The golden age of the Mercian emperors, with their letters to popes and their imitation Arab coins, was about to be smashed by men who didn't care about diplomacy, only about plunder. The longships were in the water, and the nightmare of the 9th century was about to begin. The year is 793. It is June, a month of high summer, when the days in Northumbria stretch out endlessly, the twilight barely fading before the sun rises again. On the holy island of Lindisfarne, the monks were going about their rhythm of prayer and labor. They were the spiritual successors of Cuthbert and Aidan, living in what they believed was a sanctuary protected by the very hand of God. They felt safe. The sea was their wall, their isolation, their shield. But on the 8th of June, the horizon darkened. The sails appeared first, square, striped, ominous. Then came the prows, carving through the surf like predatory beasts. The men who leaped into the shallow water didn't carry crosses, they carried axes. The raid on Lindisfarne was not a battle, it was a desecration. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it with a trembling hand. Miserable ravages of heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne by rapine and slaughter. The raiders stripped the gold from the altars, trampled the holy relics, and cut down the monks where they stood. Some were drowned in the sea. Others were dragged away in chains to be sold in the slave markets of the north. When the news reached the scholar Alcuin, living safely at the court of Charlemagne, he wrote a letter that still chills the blood. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Behold, the church of Saint Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God. It was a psychic shock. To the Anglo-Saxons, this wasn't just piracy. It was the apocalypse. They couldn't understand how God could allow his own house to be burned. They interpreted it as judgment. They looked inward, searching for sins to confess, believing that if they prayed harder, the ships would stop coming. They didn't stop. The attackers were the Vikings, Norsemen, and Danes from the icy fjords of Scandinavia. They were driven by a complex mix of factors: overpopulation at home, a desire for wealth, political exiles seeking new lands, and a culture that valorized martial courage above all else. But the key to their sudden explosion onto the world stage was a piece of technology: the longship. The Viking longship was a masterpiece of naval engineering. It was clinker-built, meaning the planks overlapped, riveted together to create a hull that was flexible. It could twist and bend with the waves rather than breaking. But its true genius was its draft. A longship could cross the open, violent North Sea, yet it needed only a few feet of water to float. This meant the Vikings didn't need harbors. They could sail up shallow rivers, deep into the heart of the country, strike a farm or a monastery 50 miles inland, and be gone before the local fyrd could even find their spears. For the next few decades, the raids were seasonal. The summer army, they called it. The Vikings would arrive with the good weather, pillage the coastlines, and return home for the harvest. England became a terrified pantry for the north. The political landscape of the Heptarchy, the Seven Kingdoms, began to fracture under the strain. Northumbria, once the beacon of learning, collapsed into a snake pit of civil war, kings assassinating each other with such frequency that the Vikings hardly needed to intervene. East Anglia, exposed on the eastern flank, cowered and paid tribute. Mercia, the great imperial power of Offa, began to rot from the inside. After Offa's death, Mercia had tried to maintain its grip on the south, but the heavy-handed dominance of the Midland kings had bred resentment, and waiting in the wings was the underdog, Wessex. Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, had been a second-tier power for a century. But in 802, a man named Egbert, or Ecgbert, claimed the throne. Egbert is a fascinating figure because he connects the dots of European history. In his youth, he had been exiled by Offa and had spent years living at the court of Charlemagne in Aachen. He had seen how a great empire was run. He had learned the arts of war and statecraft from the master. When he returned to Wessex, he didn't just want to be a local king. He bided his time, building his strength while Mercia crumbled under weak leadership. The turning point came in 825 at the Battle of Ellendun. It was fought on a grassy down near Swindon. The Mercian army, led by King Beornwulf, met the forces of Egbert. We don't have the tactical details, the clash of shield walls, the arrows darkening the sky, but we know the result. The stream, it was said, ran red with gore. Mercia was broken. The collapse was domino-like. Kent, Surrey, Sussex, and Essex, tired of Mercian taxes and arrogance, threw open their gates to Egbert. They welcomed him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Even the East Anglians asked for his protection against the Mercians. In one stroke, the balance of power flipped. The center of gravity moved from the Midlands to the south, to Winchester. Egbert became the new Bretwalda. In 829, he even marched north to the border of Northumbria. The Northumbrian king, seeing the writing on the wall, didn't fight. He met Egbert at Dore and offered him submission and peace. For a brief, flickering moment, Egbert was technically the king of all the English. But this unity was fragile. It was a unity of parchment and promises, not of deep administration. And it was happening against a backdrop of darkening skies. The raids were getting worse. The Vikings weren't just hitting monasteries anymore. They were hitting towns. Southampton was sacked. Portland was raided. In 836, Egbert himself was defeated by a Danish force at Carhampton. He bounced back to win a victory at Hingston Down in 838, where he crushed a combined army of Vikings and Cornish rebels. But the warning was clear. The enemy was adapting. They were making alliances. The terror of this period is hard to overstate. Imagine living in a coastal village. Every time the fog rolled in, you wondered if death was hiding inside it. The church added a new line to its litany, a furore Normanorum libera nos, Domine. From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, O Lord. The psychological impact on the Anglo-Saxons was profound. Their entire worldview was based on the idea that land and lineage were permanent. You farmed the land your grandfather farmed. You were buried in the barrow where your ancestors lay. The Vikings didn't respect any of that. They were agents of chaos. They dug up graves to steal rings from skeleton fingers. They used illuminated manuscripts to patch their sails. They were an alien force that seemed to operate outside the rules of humanity. By the time Egbert died in 839, he had laid the foundations for a unified resistance, but he left a kingdom under siege. He passed the throne to his son, Ethelwulf. Ethelwulf is often remembered as a pious, somewhat soft king, more interested in praying than fighting. This is unfair. He was a capable administrator who understood that God and the sword were two sides of the same coin. He won a massive victory against a Viking fleet at Aclea in 851, a battle that the chronicle describes as the greatest slaughter of a heathen host ever made. But Ethelwulf did something else, something unusual. He took his youngest son, a boy of just 4 or 5 years old, on a pilgrimage to Rome. The boy's name was Alfred. Imagine the impression this made on the child. Leaving the damp wooden halls of Wessex, traveling across the Alps, and arriving in the eternal city of Rome. Seeing the stone aqueducts, the Colosseum, the gold of the Vatican. It planted a seed in the boy's mind, the idea of civilization, the idea that there was something bigger than the mud and the blood of tribal warfare, a vision of order. While Ethelwulf and little Alfred were marveling at Rome, the situation back home was shifting. The nature of the Viking threat was changing. For decades, they had come in the summer and left in the winter. But in 850, a Viking fleet did not go home. They pulled their ships onto the Isle of Thanet, built a defensive rampart, and stayed. They wintered over. It was a subtle shift, but a catastrophic one. It meant they weren't just visitors anymore. They were residents. They were testing the waters, seeing if the land could support a permanent occupation. The heptarchy was effectively dead. Northumbria was a failed state. Mercia was a shadow. East Anglia was trembling. Only Wessex stood with its back straight, ruled by the House of Egbert, the last functioning dynasty in England. And they would need every ounce of that strength, because the Summer Army was just the advance guard. In 865, the lookouts on the cliffs of East Anglia saw a fleet that stretched from horizon to horizon. It wasn't a raiding party, it was a migration. It was the Mytal heathen here, the great heathen army, and it was led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, men who had come not to steal silver, but to steal the earth itself. In the autumn of 865, the farmers of East Anglia looked out at the sea and saw a floating city. It wasn't the usual scatter of 3 or 4 pirate ships. It was a fleet that blackened the water, hundreds of prows, thousands of men. This was the Michael heathen here, the great heathen army. And unlike the raiders of the past, who wanted silver chalices, these men wanted the soil under your feet. They were led by figures who seemed to have walked straight out of a nightmare and into the history books. The sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. There was Ivar the Boneless, a man whose nickname has puzzled historians for centuries. Was he double-jointed? Did he have a brittle bone disease? Or was boneless a metaphor for a snake-like, fluid cunning? Legend says he had to be carried on a shield, yet he possessed a tactical mind so sharp it cut through Saxon defenses like a hot knife. With him were his brothers, Ubba and Halfdan, commanders of terrifying reputation. They landed in East Anglia, but they didn't attack immediately. They made a deal. They demanded horses. The East Anglians, terrified and hoping to pass the buck, gave them the mounts. The Vikings spent the winter acclimatizing, gathering intelligence, and turning their sea legs into cavalry legs. Then they rode north. Northumbria was the perfect target because it was busy destroying itself. 2 rival kings, Osbert and Aella, were locked in a civil war. They were so busy fighting each other that they didn't notice the apocalypse riding up the old Roman road. The Vikings struck York, the great northern capital, on November the 1st, All Saints' Day. The city was packed with worshippers. The defenses were down. York fell in an afternoon. It would remain a Viking city, Jorvik, for nearly a century. The Northumbrian rivals, Osbert and Aella, finally realized their mistake. They combined their forces and tried to retake the city in 867. It was a slaughter. Both kings were killed. There is a dark shadow over the death of Aella. The Norse sagas claim he was subjected to the blood eagle, a ritual execution of grotesque cruelty involving the ribs and the lungs. Modern historians generally think this is a literary invention, a bit of poetic horror added by later writers to emphasize the vengeance of Ragnar's sons, since Aella had supposedly killed Ragnar. But whether he was carved open or simply hacked down in the mud, the result was the same. The ancient kingdom of Northumbria was gone. A puppet king was installed, and the army turned its eyes south. Next was Mercia. The Vikings occupied Nottingham. The king of Mercia, Burgred, called for help from his brother-in-law down in Wessex, King Ethelred. The West Saxon army marched up, but there was no battle. The Vikings stayed behind the thick walls of Nottingham, refusing to come out and fight. Eventually, the merchants paid them to leave. It was the beginning of the Danegeld, the Dane gold, the protection money that would drain the English economy for generations. In 869, the army returned to East Anglia. This time, they didn't want horses, they wanted the king. King Edmund of East Anglia was a young man, pious and brave, but he was hopelessly outmatched. He was captured after a disastrous battle. The story of his death is the stuff of medieval hagiography, but it rests on a bed of hard truth. The Vikings demanded he renounce his faith and rule as a sub-king under heathen overlords. Edmund refused. He was tied to a tree. The Vikings used him for target practice. The chroniclers say he was shot with so many arrows he looked like a hedgehog or a thistle. Finally, they cut off his head and threw it into the deep briar of the woods. Legend says a wolf guarded the head until it could be reunited with the body, crying out, "Hick, hick, hick, here, here, here." Edmund became a saint instantly. The monastery built over his body became Bury St. Edmunds. But a dead saint doesn't stop an army. East Anglia was erased from the map as an independent kingdom. Now, only Wessex was left. By 870, the great heathen army had devoured 3 of the 4 great kingdoms. They turned their gaze toward the Thames. Wessex was the last lamp burning in a dark house. If it flickered out, the English language, the English church, the very idea of England would likely have vanished, replaced by a Scandinavian province. The Vikings set up camp at Reading, a strategic site between the Thames and the Kennet rivers. They built ramparts and prepared to push west. Leading the defense of Wessex were 2 brothers, King Ethelred I and his younger brother, the 21-year-old Prince Alfred. They were a tight unit. Ethelred was the authority, the crowned head. Alfred was the secundarius, the second in command, the trusted lieutenant. They attacked the Vikings at Reading and were beaten back. It was a bloody nose, a reality check. But they didn't rout. They regrouped, retreating onto the high chalk ridges of the Berkshire Downs. The Vikings pursued, sensing a kill. This leads us to the Battle of Ashdown, January 871. It is one of the few battles where we can almost see the cinematic camera angles. The Vikings held the high ground on a ridge, split into 2 shield walls. One led by the kings, Bagsec and Halfdan. The other by the Jarls, the Earls. The Saxons mirrored them below. Ethelred would take the kings, Alfred would take the Jarls. But there was a delay. It was early morning. King Ethelred was in his tent, hearing mass. The priest was chanting. The prayers were long, and Ethelred refused to leave until the service was finished. "I will not serve man before I serve God," he reportedly said. Meanwhile, outside, Alfred was watching the Vikings. They were moving. They were coming down the hill. If the Saxons waited any longer, they would be smashed before they could form their lines. Alfred was in a bind. He couldn't order the king, but he couldn't wait for him. So he made a decision that likely saved England. He didn't wait. The chronicler Asser, who knew Alfred personally, describes him acting like a wild boar. He ordered the charge. The West Saxon shield wall surged uphill, crashing into the Viking line around a gnarled, solitary thorn tree that stood on the ridge. The clash was thunderous, iron on lindenwood, the screams of men, the crunch of bone. Alfred held the line against superior numbers. Finally, Ethelred emerged from his prayers and joined the fray, bringing fresh troops. The Viking line broke. King Bagsec was killed. 5 Jarls were killed. The snow was stained red for miles as the heathens fled back to Reading. It was a victory, glorious and necessary. It proved the Vikings were not invincible demons. They were men who bled and ran. But it wasn't the end. 871 is known as the Year of Battles. There were 9 major engagements that year, not counting endless skirmishes. The Vikings were like a hydra. You cut off one head, and another arrived from overseas. A new summer army arrived at Reading to reinforce the survivors. At the Battle of Meriton, just 2 months after Ashdown, the Saxons were defeated. The grind was taking its toll. And then tragedy struck. Shortly after Easter, King Ethelred died. He wasn't old, but he was worn out by the relentless campaigning, and perhaps wounded in the earlier fights. He left 2 young sons, but in this age of blood and iron, a child could not sit on the throne. The Witan, the council of wise men, looked to the only man who could possibly hold the sword, Alfred. Alfred didn't want the job. He writes later about the burden of kingship, the crushing weight of it. When he was crowned in April 871, there was no feasting. The Vikings were on the march again. His very first act as king was to ride out to Wilton to fight. He lost. The West Saxon army was exhausted. They were a militia of farmers who had been fighting for months. They needed to go home and plant their crops, or there would be a famine to go along with the war. Alfred, pragmatic and desperate, did the only thing he could. He opened the treasury. He paid the Vikings to leave. It was a humiliation, but it was a calculated one. He bought peace. He bought time. The Vikings, happy with the gold and realizing that Wessex was a tough nut to crack compared to the others, took the cash and marched away to winter in London, which was Mercian territory. Alfred watched them go. He knew they would be back. He had emptied the vaults, but he had saved the kingdom from immediate annihilation. He now had a few precious years of relative quiet. He used them to think. Alfred wasn't just a warrior. He was an intellectual. He looked at the disasters of the past few years and asked why. Why were the Christians losing? Why were the pagans winning? He concluded that it was a punishment from God for the decay of learning and wisdom. The people had forgotten the old books. The priests couldn't read Latin. They had become stupid and lazy in their faith. So God had sent the Vikings as a flail. To defeat the Vikings, Alfred believed he needed to do 2 things. He needed to build better ships and walls, yes, but he also needed to make his people smarter. He needed a spiritual rearmament. But before he could build his schools, the storm returned. In 876, a new Viking leader named Guthrum appeared. He wasn't interested in a quick raid. He wanted Wessex. He slipped past Alfred's army and seized Wareham. Alfred blockaded him. They swore oaths on holy rings. Guthrum lied, slipped away by night, and seized Exeter. It was a game of cat and mouse. Alfred was chasing shadows. Every time he thought he had them pinned, they slipped away or made a truce they had no intention of keeping. Then came the winter of 878. The 12th night of Christmas, Alfred was at his royal estate in Chippenham, celebrating the feast. It was deep winter, a time when armies usually slept. But Guthrum didn't sleep. Under the cover of darkness, the Viking army rode out of the frost and struck Chippenham. They caught the Saxons completely off guard. The royal hall was overrun. There was slaughter in the doorways. Alfred, the King of Wessex, the last hope of England, barely escaped with his life. He fled into the night with a handful of loyal retainers. He didn't go to a castle. He didn't go to a city. He went into the swamps. He vanished into the Somerset levels, a vast, sodden landscape of reeds and marshes where a man could disappear. The kingdom had fallen. The Vikings occupied the royal estates. The people submitted. To the outside world, it looked like it was over. The line of Egbert was broken. The map was now entirely heathen. But deep in the reeds, In the cold mud of Athelney, the king was still breathing. He was stripped of his robes, stripped of his armies, and stripped of his dignity. But he was about to find something else in that swamp. He was about to find the grit that earns a man the title, the Great. The King of Wessex is sitting on a three-legged stool in a peasant's hut, staring into a fire. Outside, the wind is howling across the Somerset levels, a vast flat expanse of reed beds, alder forests, and stagnant water. It is a landscape that belongs more to the otters and the herons than to men. It is the spring of 878, and Alfred, the last hope of Christian England, is technically a vagrant. This is the setting for the most famous story in English history, the burning of the cakes. You probably know it. Alfred, incognito, is asked by a peasant woman to watch her bread cakes baking on the hearth, while she goes out to milk the cow or gather wood. Alfred, his mind consumed by the catastrophic loss of his kingdom and the terrifying logistics of survival, forgets to watch them. The cakes burn. The woman returns, smells the smoke, and boxes the ears of the King of England, scolding him for being a lazy lout who is happy to eat but too idle to cook. Did it happen? Maybe. It appears in early lives of Saint Neot, but not in Asser's biography. But like the story of George Washington and the cherry tree, it survives because it feels true. It captures the utter humiliation of Alfred's position. He has fallen from the high seat of the mead hall to the dirt floor of a swamp hovel. He is stripped of his retinue, his finery, and his power. He is just a man with a headache, staring at the embers of his failure. But Athelney, the island of princes, wasn't just a hiding place. It was an incubator. Alfred wasn't just sulking, he was planning. He built a small fortification on the dry patch of land rising out of the marshes. From this base, he began to wage a guerrilla war. It was a terrifying, intimate kind of violence. Alfred and his small band of thanes, nobles who had stayed loyal, would slip out in the darkness, paddling small boats through the reed channels. They would intercept Viking foraging parties, strike quickly, seize food and weapons, and vanish back into the mist. They were ghosts. This period in the marshes transformed Alfred. Before this, he was a conventional prince, brave, yes, but operating within the standard rules of engagement. In the swamp, he learned that a king isn't defined by his crown, but by his connection to his people. He had to rely on the local men of Somerset for food, for intelligence, for shelter. He learned the landscape of his kingdom in a way few monarchs ever do, boot deep in its mud. Weeks passed. The winter broke. The sun began to warm the sodden earth. Alfred sent out the word. It was a whisper network, runners moving through the woods, carrying a message to the men of Wiltshire, Somerset, and Hampshire. The king is alive. Meet him at Egbert Stone. Egbert Stone was likely a boundary marker on the edge of the great forest of Selwood. In the 7th week after Easter, the men of the Fyrd, the citizen militia, converged there. The scene described in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is electric. When the troops saw Alfred riding out of the woods, they received him with vast rejoicing. For they had thought he was dead. They had thought England was dead. And here he was, leaner, harder, and ready to lead them. It was a resurrection. They didn't waste time. They marched. They moved with a speed and discipline that suggests Alfred had used his downtime to rethink military logistics. They camped at Ely Oak, then moved to attack the main Viking army at Eddington Ethandun. Guthrum, the Viking warlord, must have been stunned. He thought he was the master of Wessex. He was comfortably occupying the royal estate at Chippenham. Suddenly, scouts came riding in, screaming that the dead king was marching on him with thousands of spears. Guthrum scrambled his forces and marched out to meet them. The Battle of Edington is the climax of the first season of English history. It took place on a high ridge. The Saxons had to fight uphill, a classic disadvantage. But Alfred had learned. He formed a shield wall. A shield wall is not a complex tactic, but it is a brutal test of nerve. Men stand shoulder to shoulder, overlapping their round lindenwood shields to form a continuous barrier. The enemy does the same. Then, the two walls smash into each other. It becomes a rugby scrum with axes. It is a shoving match. You have to push the man in front of you, while stabbing over the rim of your shield with your spear. If the line breaks, you die. If you slip in the mud, you die. The battle raged for hours. The sources say Alfred fought prudently, which likely means he kept his head while everyone else was losing theirs. He rotated his men, keeping the front line fresh. The Viking fury, the berserker rage that had terrified Europe, crashed against the Saxon shields and found no purchase. Finally, the Viking line buckled. The Saxons surged forward. The retreat turned into a rout. Alfred's men pursued them all the way back to the fortress at Chippenham, cutting down fugitives as they ran. They trapped Guthrum inside the fortress. This is where Alfred changed the game. In the past, kings would often let the enemy go in exchange for a promise and a hostage. Alfred knew promises were cheap to a Viking. He decided to besiege them properly. He surrounded the fort. He cut off the food. He cut off the water. He waited. For 2 weeks, the Vikings starved. They were eating their horses. They were terrified. Finally, Guthrum sent a messenger. He would surrender. He would give hostages, as many as Alfred wanted, without asking for any in return. A huge concession. And most shockingly, he promised that he would be baptized. Alfred accepted. 3 weeks later, at a place called Aller, near the marshes that had been Alfred's home, the ceremony took place. Guthrum, the scourge of the Christians, the man who had murdered monks and burned libraries, was dipped into the holy water. He emerged as Athelstan. And who was his godfather? Alfred. This was a stroke of genius. By becoming Guthrum's godfather, Alfred established a spiritual hierarchy. In the eyes of the church and the law, a godfather is a father figure, a guide, a superior. Guthrum was no longer an equal rival. He was a spiritual son. It bound him into the Christian family of kings. It gave him a reason to keep his word, not just honor, but the safety of his soul. They celebrated for 12 days at Wedmore. It must have been a surreal banquet. Saxon thegns and Viking jarls, who had been trying to disembowel each other a month earlier, were now drinking mead together. Alfred gave Guthrum generous gifts: gold, weapons, cloaks. He showed him that there was profit in peace. Guthrum, now Athelstan, kept his word. He took his army and left Wessex. He moved to East Anglia, settled down, and ruled there as a Christian king until his death. He minted coins with his baptismal name. He never attacked Wessex again. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum formalized the division of England. A line was drawn across the map, running up the Thames, up the Lear, and across to the old Roman Watling Street. To the south and west lay Alfred's England, Wessex, English Mercia. To the north and east lay the Danelaw, the place where Danish law and custom prevailed. Alfred had not reconquered the whole island. He had saved a corner of it. But he had proved that the Vikings could be beaten. He had stopped the avalanche. But Alfred knew that Edington was just a reprieve. The great heathen army was gone, but other Vikings would come. The sea was still full of wolves. He couldn't rely on miracles or swamps next time. He needed a system. He looked at his kingdom and saw that it was defenseless. The old system of calling up the Fyrd took too long. By the time the farmers grabbed their spears, the Vikings had already burned the village and left. He needed a standing army. He needed fortifications. And so, the architect began his work. Alfred realized that to save England, he had to rebuild it from the ground up. He had to turn his agricultural kingdom into a fortress state. He began to draw up plans for a network of fortified towns, the burhs, that would ensure no Englishman was ever more than 20 miles from safety. But even more importantly, he looked at the minds of his people. He remembered the burning cakes, the symbol of his own distraction and failure. He believed that the Vikings had been a punishment for ignorance. To prevent them from returning, he had to make his people wise. He had to teach them to read. The warrior king put down his sword and picked up a pen. The man who had hidden in the marshes was about to start a revolution of the mind. Most kings in history are remembered for how they destroyed things. Alexander the Great is famous for burning Persepolis. Caesar is famous for subjugating Gaul. But Alfred is the rare, strange exception, a king who is remembered for what he built. After the adrenaline of Edington and the drama of the baptism, Alfred returned to a kingdom that was technically at peace, yet physically and spiritually ruined. The Vikings had burned the libraries, smashed the bridges, and left the people terrified. Alfred looked at this wreckage and decided to do something unprecedented. He didn't just want to repair the damage. He wanted to design a system that would make a Viking conquest impossible. He became the architect of England. His first move was military, but it was also a feat of civil engineering. He realized that the old way of fighting, waiting for the Vikings to attack and then trying to gather the farmers, was too slow. By the time the Fyrd arrived, the Vikings were gone. So, Alfred created the burhs. A burh, the root of our modern word burrow or burg, was a fortified town. Alfred laid out a grid of them across Wessex. He picked strategic spots, old Roman ruins like Winchester and Exeter, river crossings like Oxford, and promontories like Wareham. In these places, he ordered massive earthworks to be thrown up, ditches dug deep, banks piled high, topped with wooden palisades. But here is the genius part. He didn't just build forts, he built a bureaucracy to maintain them. We have a document from this time called the Burgelheidage. It is a stunning piece of administrative data. It lists 33 fortified places and calculates exactly how many men are needed to defend the walls. The formula was precise. 4 men for every pole, about 5.5 yards of wall. This meant that every landowner in the district knew exactly what his tax burden was. He didn't pay in gold, he paid in manpower. If you owned 5 hides of land, you had to provide 1 soldier to the local burh. It turned the defense of the realm into a community project. The result was that no village in Wessex was more than 20 miles, a day's march, from a fortress. When the Vikings returned a few years later, and they did, they found a very different England. They would land, expecting easy plunder, only to find the local population retreating behind high earthen walls, garrisoned by men who were fed, armed, and ready. The Vikings were excellent at raiding, but they were terrible at siege warfare. They would stare at the walls, get hungry, and eventually leave. The burrs worked. Alfred didn't stop at the walls. He reorganized the army itself. He split the fyrd into two rotating shifts. Half were at home, half were out on service. The Chronicle tells us this solved the classic problem of citizen armies. If the soldiers are fighting all summer, who harvests the wheat? If the wheat isn't harvested, everyone starves in the winter. Alfred's rotation system ensured that the economy kept humming even while the wars were fighting. He even tried his hand at naval architecture. He ordered ships to be built that were swifter, steadier, and higher than the Danish longships. Some had 60 oars. The records suggest they were a bit of a mixed bag. Sometimes they were too big to maneuver in the shallow estuaries where the fighting happened. But the intent was clear. Alfred was taking the fight to the water. He is often called the father of the Royal Navy. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but he certainly bought the cradle. But if the burrs were the body of the New England, the books were its soul. This is where Alfred truly earns the title, the Great. Alfred believed that the Viking invasions were a punishment from God because the English had neglected wisdom. He looked around his court and realized with horror that almost no one could read Latin anymore. The priests were mumbling prayers they didn't understand. The connection to the accumulated knowledge of the past was severed. So, the king went back to school. In his late 30s, amidst the stress of ruling, he learned to read, and he invited the smartest men he could find to his court. Grimbald from France, Asser from Wales, John from Saxony. He created a court school, not just for his own children, but for the sons of his nobles. Then he did something radical. He decided that if the people couldn't learn Latin, the books had to learn English. He set up a translation program. He personally translated key works: Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, and St. Augustine's Soliloquies. Imagine the president or the prime minister taking time out of their day to translate Aristotle into modern slang for the general public. That's what Alfred was doing. In the preface to the Pastoral Care, he wrote a letter to his bishops that is one of the most moving documents of the Middle Ages. He remembers the good old days before the burnings, and then he sets out his manifesto. Therefore, it seems better to me that we turn some of those books, which are most necessary for all men to know, into the language which we can all understand. He wanted every freeborn young man in England who had the means to be taught to read English. It was a democratization of knowledge that was centuries ahead of its time. To encourage this, he used a carrot and stick approach. He gave his bishops expensive gifts, precious astles or pointers to help them follow the text. The most famous survivor is the Alfred Jewel, found in a marsh in Somerset, perhaps lost by the king himself. It is a teardrop of rock crystal, encasing an enamel figure of a man holding flowers, with the inscription in gold, Elfred mec het gewerken. Alfred ordered me to be made. It is a tiny, beautiful object, but it represents a massive idea. The king investing his gold not in swords, but in literacy. On the flip side, he told his judges and ealdormen that if they were illiterate, they would lose their jobs. Suddenly, a lot of middle-aged nobles started learning their ABCs. He also codified the law. The Doom Book, from the Old English Dom, meaning judgment, was his attempt to blend the laws of Moses with the customs of the Saxons. He prefaced his law code with the Ten Commandments, effectively saying, English law isn't just about what the king says, it's about what God says. He wanted to create a society where justice was fair, not just for the rich, but for the weak. Judge very evenly, he wrote. Do not judge one judgment to the rich and another to the poor. It sounds idealistic, and perhaps it was. But Alfred was trying to drag his people out of the mud of the vendetta culture and into a world of written justice. As the 890s rolled on, the system was tested. A fresh Viking army attacked, led by a leader named Hastin. They were fast, aggressive, and hungry, but this time they weren't fighting a disorganized rabble. They were fighting a machine. They were chased from burh to burh. They were blockaded by the new ships. They were outmaneuvered by the rotating army. After 3 years of frustrating failure, the Viking army simply broke up. The army had not, the chronicle boasts, by the grace of God, utterly broken the English nation. That is the vindication of Alfred's life. He didn't just win a battle, he built a nation that could survive a war. Alfred died on October 26, 899. He was likely only in his early 50s, but he was an old man physically. He had suffered his entire life from a mysterious, painful illness, possibly Crohn's disease or piles, that caused him constant agony. He had carried the weight of the crown through the darkest moments in English history. He was buried in Winchester, the capital he had rebuilt. His bones, like those of so many others, would eventually be lost, moved by monks, scattered by prison builders in the 18th century. But his monument wasn't a grave. It was the English language. It was the idea of England, not just as a piece of land, but as a community of shared laws and shared faith. He is the only English monarch to be styled the Great. It's a title that usually goes to conquerors. Alfred earned it by being a teacher. He left behind a kingdom that was stronger, richer, and smarter than the one he found. But he also left behind a family. His son, Edward, and his daughter, Ethelflaed, were not the usual spoiled royal brats. They had been raised in the school of Alfred. They had watched him build the burhs. They had listened to him read the books. And as the old king closed his eyes, they stood ready to take the machine he had built and drive it north, right into the heart of the Viking lands. The defense was over. The reconquest was about to begin. When a great man dies, history usually holds its breath, waiting for the inevitable collapse. The empire fractures, the suns squabble, and the golden age turns to rust. But when Alfred the Great was laid to rest in Winchester in 899, something very different happened. The engine he had built didn't stop. In fact, under the hands of his children, it revved up. Welcome to the sequel that might just be better than the original. This is the story of the greatest brother-sister act in English history, Edward the Elder and Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians. Edward took the throne of Wessex. He wasn't the intellectual his father was. We don't have translations of philosophy from him. But he was a hammer. He was a man of action, methodical and relentless. But he didn't start with a parade. He started with a family feud. Alfred's nephew, a man named Ethelwold, felt cheated. He had a claim to the throne, perhaps even a better one by strict primogeniture. But the Wheaton had chosen Edward. Ethelwald didn't take it well. He did the unthinkable. He fled to the Vikings. He went to the Danelaw, to the Northumbrian Danes, and said, "Make me your king, and I'll give you England." It was a nightmare scenario. A Saxon prince leading a Viking army against his own cousin. For 3 years, it was a messy, dangerous civil war. It culminated in the Battle of the Home in 902. Technically, the Vikings won the field, but in the chaos, Ethelwald was killed. The pretender was dead. Edward wiped the blood off his sword and looked north. The distraction was over. Now, the real work could begin. But Edward wasn't working alone. To understand this era, you have to look at Mercia. Mercia was technically an independent kingdom ruled by an ealdorman named Ethelred. But Ethelred was married to Edward's sister, Ethelflaed. And as Ethelred grew older and sicker, the power in Mercia shifted. It didn't go to a council of men. It went to Ethelflaed. She is one of the most singular figures in the medieval world. In a society that was aggressively patriarchal, where women were usually political pawns or cloistered nuns, Ethelflaed ruled. She led armies. She negotiated treaties. She built cities. The chroniclers didn't know what to call her. Queen was a loaded word in Wessex, due to some old scandals. So they called her Mercna Leftage, the Lady of the Mercians. It sounds gentle, but there was nothing gentle about her. Together, the siblings launched the Reconquest. Their strategy was brilliant in its boredom. They didn't just rush out and fight battles. They used their father's invention, the burr, as an offensive weapon. It was a strategy of creeping fortification. They would march into Viking territory, the borderlands of the Danelaw, and simply build a fortress, a massive garrison town right on the enemy's doorstep. This cut off the Viking supply lines, dominated the local roads, and provided a safe haven for Saxon troops. Then they would move forward another 20 miles and do it again. It was a slow, suffocating constrictor snake of a campaign. While Edward pushed up from the south, attacking Essex and East Anglia, Ethelflaed pushed from the west, moving into the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw: Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, Stamford. The Vikings of the Danelaw were getting nervous. In 910, they decided to launch a preemptive strike. A massive Viking army from Northumbria swept down into Mercia, hoping to break the back of this new alliance. They ravaged the countryside, thinking they could loot and scoot before the Saxons could react. They were wrong. Edward and Ethelflaed's forces caught them at Tettenhall, near modern-day Wolverhampton. The Battle of Tettenhall was the decisive clash of the generation. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it with grim satisfaction. The Viking army was pinned. The shield walls slammed together. The Saxon trap snapped shut. Thousands of Vikings were slaughtered, including 3 of their kings. It was a catastrophe for the Northmen. The northern Vikings never seriously threatened the Midlands again. The snake had bitten back. With the northern threat neutralized, Ethelflaed went on a tear. She was a master of what we might call urban warfare. She didn't just fight in fields, she took cities. In 917, she marched on Derby, one of the Viking strongholds. The fighting was fierce, right at the gates. The chronicle tells us that 4 of her personal thegns, men she had raised and trained, were killed right before her eyes. You can imagine the fury that must have unleashed. Derby fell. The next year, she took Leicester without a fight. The Vikings there, seeing what had happened to their neighbors, surrendered peacefully. The reputation of the lady was becoming a weapon in itself. Even the Vikings of York, the hard-bitten survivors of the Ragnarsson era, began to send envoys. They were ready to submit to her, not to Edward, to her. But then, the tragedy of timing intervened. In June 918, just as she was at the zenith of her power, sitting in her royal hall at Tamworth, Ethelfled died. Her body was carried to Gloucester, to the priory she had built, and buried next to her husband. Her death left a vacuum. The Mercian nobles, loyal to her memory, proclaimed her daughter, Aelfwine, as the new lady of the Mercians. It looked like a matrilineal dynasty was forming. Edward, down in Wessex, heard the news. He was a grieving brother, but he was a ruthless king. He couldn't risk a separate Mercian power base, especially one led by an untested niece. He marched north. He occupied Tamworth. He deprived Aelfwine of all authority and sent her into a nunnery in Wessex. It was a cold-hearted political move. He extinguished the independence of Mercia in an afternoon. But it was also the moment that England truly began to coalesce. There were no longer two allied kingdoms. There was one kingdom, under one king. Edward didn't stop to apologize. He kept the momentum going. With the combined armies of Wessex and Mercia, the Danelaw collapsed. The Viking Jarls of East Anglia submitted. The garrisons of Nottingham and Stamford opened their gates. By the end of 918, Edward ruled everything south of the Humber. He spent his final years tightening the screws. He built more burghs at Manchester, at Thelwall, at Rhuddlan in Wales. He was obsessed with security. He received the submission of the Welsh kings, the Scottish king, and the remaining Vikings of Northumbria. They all chose him as father and lord. It was a high point. But Edward's reign is often overshadowed by his father's fame and his son's glory. He is the middle child of history, doing the hard, unglamorous work of implementation. Alfred drew the blueprints. Edward laid the bricks. He took a kingdom that was on the brink of survival and turned it into the dominant superpower of the island. He had a large family, 3 wives, over a dozen children. His daughters married into the royal houses of Europe, one to the King of France, one to the father of the Holy Roman Emperor. The House of Wessex was going global, but as Edward grew old, the shadows of succession began to lengthen again. He had many sons, and they didn't all like each other. When he died in 924, leading an army against a rebellion in Cheshire, the kingdom held its breath again. He left behind a transformed landscape. The Viking threat wasn't gone. The Norsemen still held York and the far north, but the dynamic had shifted forever. The Saxons were no longer the victims. They were the conquerors. The Boers stood as silent sentinels over a land that was slowly forgetting the terror of the raids and learning the habits of unity. But to finish the job, to push the boundary all the way to the Scottish border and create the kingdom we recognize today, it would take someone even more impressive than Edward. It would take a man who is arguably the first true King of England, a man with a golden name and a sword that would ring out at the most famous battle you've probably never heard of. Edward the Elder was dead. Long live the bastard prince. When Edward the Elder died in 924, the crown didn't just slide neatly onto the next head. It wobbled. There was a brief, murky period where Edward's son, Aelfweard, was technically king in Wessex, while Athelstan was declared king in Mercia. It looked for a terrifying moment, like the kingdom was going to split right back down the middle. But then, Aelfweard conveniently died just 16 days after his father. It's one of those historical coincidences that makes you raise an eyebrow. But let's give Athelstan the benefit of the doubt. Athelstan was 30 years old, a grown man, fully formed. He was different. There were whispers about his mother, a woman named Ekwyn. Some said she was a noblewoman. Others gossiped that she was a shepherd's daughter that Edward had met in his wild youth. This rumor of illegitimacy dogged Athelstan, but it also gave him a chip on his shoulder the size of a shield boss. He had to be better, sharper, and more kingly than anyone else just to prove he belonged. He had been raised not in the stuffy court of Winchester, but in the war-torn marches of Mercia by his aunt Ethelflaed. She had trained him. When he was just a boy, his grandfather Alfred had ceremonially invested him with a scarlet cloak, a gem-studded belt, and a Saxon sword with a gilded scabbard. It was a blessing from the grave. When he finally took the throne, he didn't just want to be king of the Anglo-Saxons. He wanted the whole map. In 927, he made his move. The Viking king of York, Sihtric, died. Athelstan didn't wait for a successor to emerge. He marched north with a speed that dazzled his enemies. He kicked out the Viking claimants and smashed the gates of York. For the first time since the Romans left, a southern king walked the streets of the northern capital. But he didn't stop there. On July 12, 927, at a place called Amont Bridge in Cumbria, Athelstan hosted the Ultimate Power Summit. He summoned the kings of the north, Constantine of Scotland, Owain of Strathclyde, Hyveldia of Wales, and the bamboozled Earl of Bamber. Picture the scene. These rugged, proud kings standing by the river, looking at this golden-haired southerner who had just swallowed Northumbria whole. They had no choice. They swore oaths. They renounced idolatry, a dig at the Vikings, and effectively, they acknowledged him as their overlord. Athelstan's coins began to carry a new, heavy title, Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain. Not just England, Britain. For the next 10 years, Athelstan ruled as a European celebrity. His court was a magnet. Foreign princes were sent to him to be fostered. He raised the future king of Norway, Hakon the Good, and the future king of France, Louis d'Outremere. He was the godfather of Europe. He was also a maniacal collector of holy relics. He sent agents across the continent to buy up bones, splinters of the true cross, and anything that glowed with sanctity. He gave these treasures to monasteries like Exeter and Glastonbury, buying the prayers of the monks to secure his soul. But in the north, resentment was simmering. The King of Scots, Constantine, was an old, wily survivor. He realized that Athelstan was getting too powerful. If the English king wasn't stopped, Scotland would be next. So, Constantine did the unthinkable. He reached out to his hereditary enemies, the Vikings. He formed an alliance with Olaf Guthfrithson, the Viking king of Dublin. It was a union of the wolf and the wildcat, Norse pagans and Scottish Christians, united by a shared fear of the English dragon. They were joined by the King of Strathclyde. It was a massive anti-English coalition. In the late summer of 937, the trap was sprung. The coalition army, massive and hungry, landed in the northwest of England. They expected to ravage the country while Athelstan scrambled. But Athelstan didn't scramble. He waited. He let them raid. He let them get deep into his territory. He was gathering his strength, calling up every levy from every shire, summoning mercenary fleets. He was preparing for a battle of annihilation. The armies met at a place called Brunanburh. Here is the frustrating part. We don't know where it is. Historians have been arguing about the location for centuries. Is it Bromborough on the Wirral? Is it near Burnley? Is it in Yorkshire? The Wirral seems the most likely. It makes sense for a Dublin fleet landing. But the exact field is lost to the grass. What we do know is the violence. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle breaks out of its usual dry prose and erupts into a poem, the Battle of Brunanburh, to describe the slaughter. Past the morning star, glided over grounds, God's candle bright, the eternal Lord's, until the noble creature sank to its setting. The battle lasted all day. This was rare. Most shield wall battles were over in an hour or two. The physical exhaustion of pushing against another man while wearing chainmail is immense. But Brunanburh went on from dawn until sunset. It was a grinder. Athelstan and his younger half-brother, Edmund, remember that name, stood at the center of the line. The poem tells us they hewed the war linden with hammered swords. It was a day of carnage. The English line held. The Scots and Vikings threw themselves against it, but the sons of Edward didn't break. Finally, the coalition shattered. The field was slippery with blood. 5 young kings and 7 of Olaf's earls lay dead. Constantine, the old Scots king, fled the field, leaving his own son dead in the mud. The poem mocks him brutally. He had no cause to exult in that grey meeting. Young in war, mangled by wounds, the survivors scrambled back to their ships, the nail-battered vessels, and sailed away into the dark, humiliated. Athelstan stood on the field, the master of the island. The wolves, the ravens, and the eagles descended to feast on the carrion. The poem ends with a chilling boast. Never was there more slaughter on this island. Never yet as many people killed before this with the sword's edge. Since the Angles and Saxons came up over the broad ocean. Brunanburh was the moment England was truly forged. It proved that the unification wasn't a fluke. It was a fortress that could withstand the combined fury of the Celtic and Viking worlds. Athelstan was the undisputed apex predator of Britain. He spent the last 2 years of his life in a position of supreme authority. He issued laws that tried to regulate everything from the currency to the tracking of cattle. He was a micromanager. He wanted a kingdom that ran like a clock. But Athelstan had a personal sadness. He never married. He never had children. Some historians speculate he took a vow of chastity, perhaps to reassure his younger half-brothers that he wouldn't start a dynasty that would cut them out. Or perhaps he just didn't have the time. He was married to the job. When he died in Gloucester in October 939, around the age of 45, the stillness that followed was heavy. He was buried at Malmesbury Abbey, a place he loved, rather than with his father in Winchester. He always did pave his own path. Athelstan is the high water mark. He is the English Charlemagne. Under him, the kingdom was huge, wealthy, and feared. But the problem with high water marks is that the tide eventually goes out. Athelstan held the wolf by the ears, but he didn't kill it. The Vikings of York were beaten, but not broken. The Scots were bloodied, but still there. And now, the throne passed to a teenager. Edmund, the boy who had fought beside Athelstan at Brunanburh, was now King Edmund thus. He was 18 years old. He had a famous name and a sharp sword, but he was about to learn that holding a kingdom is much harder than winning one. The wolves were watching the boy king, and they were licking their chops. The morning after a funeral, is always the most dangerous time for a kingdom. When Athelstan, the king of all Britain, was lowered into the earth at Malmesbury, the silence that fell over the island was deceptive. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath. The crown passed to Athelstan's half-brother, Edmund. He was 18 years old. We call him Edmund the Magnificent or Edmund the Elder. But in 939, he was just a teenager with a very big pair of shoes to fill. He had fought at Brunanburh. Yes, he had stood in the shield wall and hacked at Vikings. But fighting is easy. Ruling is hard. Almost the moment the news of Athelstan's death crossed the Humber, the North revolted. The Northumbrians, who had bowed their heads to the Iron Athelstan, looked at the boy Edmund and decided they'd rather take their chances with the old gods. They invited Olaf Guthfrithson, the very same Viking warlord who had run away from Brunanburh, to come back from Dublin and be their king. Olaf didn't just take York, he marched south. He raided down into the Midlands, right into the heart of Mercia. It was a disaster. In one season, the great unified empire of Athelstan snapped in half. The border wasn't the sea anymore. It was Watling Street, the old Roman road running through the middle of England. Edmund was humiliated, but Edmund had the resilience of youth. When Olaf conveniently died in 941, God's judgment, the monks whispered. The Viking alliance crumbled. Edmund launched a counter-offensive. He didn't just retake the land, he retook the soul of the Danelaw. In 942, he marched into the 5 boroughs: Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, Stamford, and Derby. These were the fortress towns that had been Viking strongholds for decades. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle includes a short, triumphant poem about this liberation, describing the Danes living there as being in thraldom, forced to serve heathens, until Edmund broke their chains. It's an interesting spin, claiming that the settled Danes were actually happy to be rescued by a Christian English king. Whether they were happy or just terrified of his army, they submitted. Edmund was back on top. He even turned his eyes to the Celtic West. He ravaged Strathclyde, the kingdom in southern Scotland, but he didn't keep it. He gave it to Malcolm, the King of Scots, in exchange for a promise that Malcolm would be his fellow worker on sea and land. It was realpolitik. Edmund was outsourcing his border security. By 946, Edmund was 24. He was powerful, experienced, and the father of 2 young sons. The dynasty looked secure. Then came the Feast of St. Augustine, May 26, 946. Edmund was hosting a banquet at his royal estate in Bucklechurch. The wine was flowing. The mood was high. Then the king spotted a man at one of the tables who shouldn't have been there. It was Leofer, a notorious outlaw whom Edmund had banished. A smarter king might have called his guards. A colder king might have ordered an archer to shoot him. But Edmund was a warrior. He was young, drunk, and furious. He leaped over the table and tackled the outlaw himself. He grabbed Leofer by the hair and threw him to the floor. But in the scramble, Leofer pulled a hidden dagger. The King of England, the victor of the 5 boroughs, the heir of Alfred, was stabbed in the stomach in a tavern brawl in his own hall. He bled to death on the rushes, while his horror-struck thegns cut Leofer to pieces. It was a senseless, stupid tragedy. It left the kingdom in shock. Edmund's sons, Edwig and Edgar, were tiny children, toddlers. They couldn't rule. So the Witan turned to the only adult male left in the House of Wessex, Edmund's younger brother, Edred. Edred is one of the most underrated figures in this entire saga. If Edmund was the jock, Edred was the sickly intellectual with a core of steel. He suffered from a terrible chronic stomach ailment, possibly the same genetic curse that plagued Alfred. It was so bad that at times he could not swallow solid food. He had to suck the juice out of meat and spit out the fiber. He was often in pain, pale and frail. But if you thought Edred was soft, you were making a fatal mistake. If you blink in the middle of the 10th century, you might miss the reign of King Edwig. It lasted only 4 years, from 955 to 959, and it plays out like a teenage melodrama that got out of hand. Edwig was known as the All-Fair because of his astonishing good looks, but his judgment was less attractive. On the very night of his coronation feast, the most solemn moment of his life, he got bored with the old bishops and earls, stood up, and left the hall. The nobles were insulted. They sent Dunstan, the abbot of Glastonbury, to fetch him. Dunstan found the young king in a private chamber, effectively in bed with two women, a noblewoman named Ethelgifu and her daughter. The crown of England was lying carelessly on the floor. Dunstan, a man who feared God much more than he feared a teenager, physically dragged Edwig back to the banquet and forced him to sit down. Edwig never forgave him. He exiled Dunstan and seized his property, but the king had picked a fight he couldn't win. The church and the northern nobles turned against him. The kingdom split, with Edwig holding the south and his younger brother Edgar being declared king of Mercia and Northumbria. When Edwig died suddenly in 959, the causes are murky as always. The realm heaved a sigh of relief. Edgar took the throne of a reunited England at the age of 16, and for the next 16 years, the sun came out. We call him Edgar the Peaceful, but don't let the name fool you. In the Middle Ages, peace wasn't a passive state. It was a product of terrifying strength. Edgar was peaceful because nobody dared to attack him. He maintained a navy that was rumored to be so large it was divided into 3 fleets: east, west, and north. Every summer, instead of going on raids, the king would sail with his ships, circumnavigating the island, a visible reminder to every pirate and Viking warlord that the coast was watched. The wolves stayed in their dens. With the borders secure, Edgar turned his energy inward. He recalled Dunstan from exile and made him Archbishop of Canterbury. Together, they launched a revolution that would change the face of the English landscape: the monastic reform. Before this, many monasteries were really just clubs for rich priests who lived in comfortable houses, kept wives or concubines, and left their property to their children. Dunstan, along with his fiery colleagues Ethelwald and Oswald, wanted to purify the church. They introduced the rule of St. Benedict. It was strict: no wives, no private property, constant prayer, hard work. They kicked out the secular canons and replaced them with monks. It sounds harsh, but it triggered a cultural explosion. These reformed monasteries became factories of beauty. The Winchester style of art emerged: illuminated manuscripts with borders of lush, golden acanthus leaves, and figures that seemed to vibrate with energy. They built organs that roared with the sound of thunder. They produced the Benedictional of St. Ethelwald, a book so lavish it drips with gold leaf. Edgar was the patron of it all, the generous father pouring wealth into the church to buy protection for his soul and legitimacy for his crown. Edgar was also a master administrator. He reformed the currency with a ruthlessness that modern central bankers would admire. He introduced a system where the design of the silver penny was changed every few years. When the new design came out, everyone had to turn in their old coins to be melted down and restruck, for a fee, of course. It kept the silver pure. It made forgery difficult, because the coins were always new, and it made the king very, very rich. He standardized weights and measures, declaring that one measure shall be held throughout the realm, as at London and Winchester. He was knitting the economy together, but the defining moment of his reign, and perhaps the defining moment of the entire Anglo-Saxon monarchy, came in 973. Edgar had been king for 14 years. He was 30 years old. Yet, he hadn't had a formal, solemn coronation. Historians have argued for centuries about why. Was he waiting for his imperial age, the age when a man could be ordained a priest, 30, to mirror the ministry of Christ? Or was it simply that he had spent the first decade stamping out the last embers of separatism, and now wanted to announce his total victory? Whatever the reason, he chose the Roman city of Bath for the ceremony. It was a stage set with the ruins of an empire, linking him to the grandeur of Rome. The ceremony that Dunstan devised for Edgar in 973 is essentially the same ceremony used for British monarchs today. If you watch the coronation of Charles III, you were watching the ghost of Edgar's ritual. The anthem, Zadok the Priest, in its biblical text form, was sung. The ring was placed on his finger, the sword was girded, the crown was placed on his head, and most importantly, he was anointed with holy oil. This changed everything. He was no longer just a tribal warlord chosen by the Witan. He was the Christus Domini, the anointed of the Lord. To rebel against him was not just treason, it was blasphemy. His wife, Elfthryth, was crowned and anointed as queen, the first time this was explicitly done in such a high-profile way. It elevated the status of the royal wife from the king's bed companion to a divinely sanctioned partner in rule. But Edgar wasn't done with the theatre. Immediately after the coronation at Bath, he took his navy and sailed north to Chester. Chester sits on the River Dee, near the border with Wales. It was the gateway to the Celtic West. There, he summoned the other kings of Britain, and just like at Aymont Bridge with Athelstan, they came. The list of attendees reads like a who's who of the 10th century North. Kenneth, King of Scots; Malcolm, King of the Cumbrians; Maccus, King of many islands, the Viking ruler of the Hebrides; and Man, and 5 other Welsh and Norse princes. They swore fealty to Edgar. They pledged to be his co-workers by land and sea. Then they went down to the river. A royal barge was waiting. Edgar took the helm. The other kings, 8 of them, took the oars. It is an image of staggering arrogance and brilliant propaganda. The King of England steering the ship of state, while the kings of Scotland and Wales provided the muscle power. They rowed him from the palace to the church of St. John the Baptist, while the crowds cheered from the riverbanks. It was the apex of the Anglo-Saxon dream. The Bretwalda was real. The island was, for all intents and purposes, a single empire. The Viking threat had been absorbed and neutralized. The economy was booming. The monasteries were singing. Edgar must have felt invincible. He wrote to the Pope. He communicated with the Emperor Otto in Germany. He was a player on the world stage. But golden ages in the Middle Ages are fragile things. They usually depend on the heartbeat of one man. In 975, just 2 years after the triumph on the River Dee, Edgar died. He was only 32. The cause is unknown, but the suddenness of it shook the kingdom to its foundations. He was buried at Glastonbury, the spiritual heart of his realm. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, usually so stoic, breaks into verse to mourn him. Here ended his earthly joys. Edgar, of Angles king, chose him another light, beauteous and winsome, and left this frail, this barren life. And then, almost immediately, a comet appeared. In the autumn, the chronicle notes ominously, appeared the star purely called Cometa. People looked up at the streak of fire in the night sky and shivered. In the medieval mind, comets never meant anything good. They meant change. They meant famine. They meant blood. The system Edgar had built was strong, but it relied on a strong hand at the tiller. Now, the hand was gone, and left behind were two young sons by two different mothers. Edward, the elder boy, was just a child. Ethelred, the younger, was even smaller, no more than 7 or 8, and behind each boy stood a faction of ambitious nobles and a distinct rival mother. The unity of the peaceful reign evaporated overnight. The nobles who had resented the church reforms, who hated losing their land to the monks, saw their chance to grab it back. The anti-monastic reaction began. Abbeys were attacked. Monks were driven out. The peace was shattered. The Golden Age had lasted 16 years. It would take less than 3 to unravel. The sun had set on the era of the great warrior kings. Now, the long shadows were creeping back in, and waiting in the wings was a boy with a name that history would twist into a cruel joke. Ethelred, the unready. But he wasn't unready yet. He was just a frightened child, watching the adults around him sharpen their knives. Eadred inherited the crown and the chaos. The Northumbrians, true to form, decided that a sick king was an opportunity. They rebelled again, but this time they didn't invite a generic warlord. They invited a legend, Eric Bloodaxe. His name in Old Norse is Eirikr Blodux. Even in an age of violent nicknames, Bloodaxe stands out. He was an exiled king of Norway, a man who had murdered his own brothers to secure his power. Hence the name. It implies kinslaying. He was a Viking celebrity. He was married to a woman named Gunhild, who was rumored to be a witch. The sagas describe her as beautiful, cruel, and manipulative. The Lady Macbeth of the North. Eric arrived in York around 947. He didn't come to govern. He came to preside. He minted coins that are purely terrifying in their simplicity. On one side, his name. On the other, a sword. No portrait, no cross, just a sword. The message was clear. I am here, and I am violence. Edred didn't hesitate. In 948, the invalid king mustered his army and marched north. He didn't just fight a battle. He launched a punitive raid. He burned the minster at Ripon. He ravaged the countryside. He showed the Northumbrians that although he couldn't digest a steak, he could certainly digest a rebellion. As Edred's army headed south, the Vikings tried a cheap shot. They ambushed the king's rearguard at Castleford. Edred was furious. He stopped his army, turned around, and sent a message to the Witan of York. I will turn this entire province into a desert if you don't get rid of Eric. The Northumbrians, realizing Edred wasn't bluffing, panicked. They dumped Eric Bloodaxe. They kicked him out. But the North was an addiction they couldn't quit. A few years later, they invited Olaf Sitriksson back. Then they kicked him out and invited Eric Bloodaxe back for a second term. It was a revolving door of treason. By 954, everyone was tired. Edred was dying, his body wasting away. The Northumbrians were exhausted by the constant war and the burning of their crops. And Eric Bloodaxe, well, his time had run out. The end of Eric Bloodaxe is shrouded in the mists of the Pennines. He was ousted from York for the last time in 954. He fled across the moors, heading for the sea, or perhaps towards Scotland. At a lonely, desolate place called Stainmore, high in the crags, he was ambushed. It wasn't a glorious last stand. It was a dirty assassination, likely orchestrated by an earl named Oswulf, who had cut a deal with Edred. Eric was cut down. The last king of York died in the mud of a sheep track. With his death, the independent kingdom of Northumbria died forever. It never rose again. From this point on, York was ruled by an ealdorman, an earl, appointed by the King of England. The dream of a separate Viking state in the north was over. Edred had done it. The sick man had outlasted the strong men. He had unified the kingdom not just in name, but in administrative reality. He had brought the north definitively under the control of the south. But Edred paid the price. The effort killed him. He died in 955, in his early 30s, a bachelor with no children. His stomach finally gave out. He left a kingdom that was whole. The borders were set. The Vikings were broken. The machinery of government, the shires, the writs, the coinage was working. But he also left a dangerous domestic situation. Remember Edmund's sons, the toddlers. They were teenagers now. The eldest, Edwig, was ready to take the throne. He was 15 years old, handsome, arrogant, and swimming in hormones. He was about to collide head-on with the other rising power in the kingdom, the church. Specifically, he was about to collide with a man named Dunstan. Dunstan is a character we need to watch. He was a brilliant, mystical, arguably neurotic monk who would become the architect of the English church. He had been a close advisor to Edred, holding the king's hand through his illness. But Edwig didn't want a lecture. He wanted to have fun. The stage is set for a culture clash. The grim, iron-willed generation of Athelstan and Edred is passing. The new generation, raised in the safety that their fathers and uncles fought for, is taking the keys to the kingdom. And as is often the case with teenagers who inherit a fortune, things are about to get a little messy before they get golden. The sword of Bloodaxe is rusting in the heather of Stainmore. The last great external threat is gone. Now, the threats are internal. They are in the bedroom of the king and in the cloisters of the monks. The year is 978. The golden age of Edgar is fading like a dream upon waking. In the shadow of Corfe Castle in Dorset, a teenage boy sits on a horse. He is Edward, the King of England, the eldest son of the late Edgar. He has ridden out to visit his stepmother, Queen Alfthryth, and his half-brother, the 10-year-old Ethelred. He is thirsty from the hunt. He asks for a drink. As he lifts the cup of mead to his lips, an assassin steps out of the crowd. He stabs the young king in the back. The horse bolts. Edward falls, his foot catching in the stirrup. He is dragged to his death, his blood staining the dusty road. It is a crime that stuns the medieval world. A consecrated king, murdered by his own family's faction. Edward is buried quickly, almost shamefully, but miracles soon begin to happen at his grave. He becomes Edward the Martyr, and the beneficiary of this bloody deed is the boy watching from the castle gate, Ethelred. Ethelred II is crowned a month later. He is just a child, perhaps 12 years old. He sits on the throne with the ghost of his murdered brother standing behind him. It is said that at his baptism, he urinated in the font, prompting the archbishop to predict, "By God and his mother, this will be a sorry fellow." Whether true or not, the story sets the tone. Ethelred didn't stand a chance. His nickname, the Unready, is one of history's great mistranslations. In Old English, his name Ethelred means noble counsel. The nickname given to him was Unread, which means no counsel or ill-advised. It was a cruel pun. Noble counsel, the no counsel. It didn't mean he was unprepared. It meant he was bad at listening, or that he was surrounded by idiots. For the first few years, things were quiet. The boy grew up, but across the North Sea, the dynamic had changed. The Vikings weren't unwashed pirates anymore. In Denmark, a king named Sweyn Forkbeard was building a centralized military state. In Norway, Olaf Tryggvason was rising. These men were professionals, and they looked at England, rich, divided, and ruled by a boy with a stained reputation, and saw a bank vault with the door left open. In the 980s, the raids began again. At first, they were pinpricks, Southampton, Thanet, Cheshire. But in 991, the hammer fell. A massive Viking fleet, led by Olaf Tryggvason, arrived in Essex. They landed on a small island in the Blackwater estuary near the town of Maldon. The local ealdorman, a grizzled veteran named Bertnoth, called out the levy. He marched down to the shore to block them. The Battle of Maldon is immortalized in a famous Old English poem. It describes the scene perfectly. The Vikings are on the island, the Saxons are on the mainland. Between them is a causeway, flooded by the high tide. They shout insults at each other across the water. The Vikings demand gold. Bertnoth replies, "We will pay you with spear points and old swords." When the tide goes out, the Vikings try to cross. The Saxons hold the narrow causeway easily. 3 men could hold off an army there. But then, the Vikings use psychology. They shout, "This isn't a fair fight. Let us come across onto the dry ground, and we'll see who is stronger." Bertnoth, driven by overconfidence, or excessive pride, agrees. He lets them cross. It is a fatal error. The shield walls clash. Bertnoth is cut down. The Saxon line breaks. Some men flee into the woods, but the core of the household guard stays. They know their lord is dead, but they refuse to leave him. They fight until the last man falls, declaring, "Mind must be harder, heart the keener, spirit the greater, as our strength lessens." It is a glorious, tragic defeat. But the aftermath was worse. Ethelred and his council, terrified by the slaughter, decided they couldn't afford to fight Olaf again. They decided to pay. They handed over 10,000 pounds of silver. This was the first massive Danegeld. It was a catastrophic precedent. As Kipling wrote centuries later, that if once you have paid him the Danegeld, you never get rid of the Dane. The Vikings took the money, sailed home, bought better ships, and came back for more. In 994, they returned. Ethelred paid 16,000 pounds. In 1002, he paid 24,000 pounds. The economy of England was being bled dry. The royal mints were working overtime just to export the nation's wealth into the chests of Scandinavian warlords. Ethelred was trapped in a spiral of panic. He changed advisors constantly. He fired competent generals and hired sycophants. He looked for scapegoats. And in 1002, his paranoia boiled over. He had heard rumors of a plot against his life. He convinced himself that the Danish settlers in England, the people who had lived in the Danelaw for generations, who were effectively English, were a fifth column waiting to strike. On November 13th, 1002, the feast of St. Brice, Ethelred issued a secret order to all his towns and reeves. Slay all the Danish men who are in England. It is hard to know how widespread the massacre was. It wasn't a modern industrial genocide, but it was a brutal, targeted pogrom. In Oxford, a group of Danes fled into the church of St. Fritzwede for sanctuary. The mob burned the church to the ground with the people inside. Archaeologists recently found a mass grave in Oxford full of male skeletons from this period, many with blade wounds to the back. It grimly confirms the story. But Ethelred had made a mistake, a fatal, personal mistake. Among the victims, it is said, was Gunhild, the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, the King of Denmark. She was living in England with her husband. She was dragged out and beheaded, but not before predicting that her death would bring ruin to England. She was right. When Sweyn Forkbeard heard the news, he didn't send an invoice for silver. He sent the full might of Denmark. From 1003 to 1013, England was a slaughterhouse. Sweyn was a terrifying commander. He didn't just raid, he marched deep inland, burning everything in a deliberate policy of terror. He wanted to break the will of the people. Ethelred's response was a tragicomedy of errors. The chronicle laments, "When they were in the east, the army was kept in the west, and when they were in the south, our army was in the north." Every time the English army gathered, something went wrong. A commander would turn traitor, like the infamous Edric Striona, whom we will meet properly soon. The provisions would run out. The ships would be wrecked in a storm. The people began to believe that God had abandoned them. Ethelred was the unready, the man with no plan, watching his kingdom burn from the safety of London. Ethelred tried one last diplomatic play. He married Emma of Normandy. Emma was the sister of the Duke of Normandy, a powerful figure across the Channel. It was an attempt to secure a safe harbor and perhaps some military aid. It gave Ethelred a place to run to, but it also planted a seed. By bringing the Normans into English politics, Ethelred unwittingly opened the door for a future invasion that would change everything. Spoiler, 1066. But in 1013, marriage couldn't save him. Sweyn Forkbeard arrived with a fleet that was described as splendid, ships with prows of gold and silver. He didn't just want money, he wanted the crown. He sailed up the Humber. The Northumbrians, always happy to stick it to a southern king, submitted immediately. He marched south. Oxford submitted. Winchester submitted. The country simply collapsed. The people were tired of Ethelred's taxes and his failures. They chose the strong horse. Ethelred, seeing the writing on the wall, packed his bags. He sent Emma and their sons, including a boy named Edward, to Normandy. Then, the King of England, the heir of Alfred the Great, boarded a ship and fled into exile. For the first time since the dark days of Alfred in the marshes, England was conquered. Sweyn Forkbeard was declared king on Christmas Day, 1013. The House of Wessex had fallen. But history has a wicked sense of humor. Sweyn ruled for exactly 5 weeks. In February 1014, while at his capital in Gainsborough, Sweyn shouted out in the night that he had been struck by a spear. He died in agony. The monks said it was the ghost of Saint Edmund, the one shot full of arrows by Vikings centuries earlier, returning to avenge the looting of his shrine. Suddenly, the board was reset. The Danish army proclaimed Sweyn's son, Cnut, as king. But the English nobles, The Witan had a different idea. They sent a message to Normandy, to the exiled Ethelred. It is one of the most remarkable job offers in history. They said they would take him back as their lord, if he promised to govern them better than he did before. Ethelred agreed. He sailed back to England in the spring of 1014. He was greeted with joy. He marched on Lindsey, where Cnut was preparing his army. Cnut, young and not yet ready for a full-scale war, fled to his ships. He sailed away, but not before mutilating the English hostages he held, cutting off their hands, ears, and noses, and dumping them on the beach at Sandwich. A grim parting gift. Ethelred was king again, but the dragon hadn't left. It had just gone to sharpen its claws. Nut would be back, and Ethelred was old, sick, and tired. The final act of the tragedy was approaching, but this time, Ethelred wouldn't be fighting alone. He had a son, a warrior who was everything his father wasn't. A man made of iron. In the spring of 1016, the air in London was thick with smoke and fear. Outside the walls, the Danish army of Cnut was circling like a pack of wolves, their ships crowding the Thames. Inside the walls, King Ethelred was dying. He had returned from exile, promising to be a better king. But his body had failed him even as his enemies multiplied. On St. George's Day, April 23rd, Ethelred the Unready took his last breath. He had reigned for 38 years, the longest reign of any Anglo-Saxon king. But he left behind a legacy of ruin. The Chronicles sums it up with a heavy sigh. He ended his days after much toil and many difficulties. But the city of London didn't mourn for long. They didn't have time. They immediately proclaimed his son, Edmund, as king. Edmund was everything his father was not. He was young, roughly 26, and he was built of different stuff. He was a brawler. He didn't hide in his chambers. He lived in the saddle. History remembers him as Edmund Ironside, a name earned not because he wore heavy armor, but because of his sheer physical durability. He was the man who wouldn't stay down. The year 1016 is the most frenetic year in English military history. It was a heavyweight boxing match that spanned the entire country. While the wobbly nobles in Southampton voted for Cnut to be king, the citizens of London and the warriors of the Fyrd backed Edmund. Edmund didn't wait to be besieged. He broke out of London. He rode west to Wessex, his family's ancient heartland, to raise an army. And the people came. They were tired of paying Danegeld. They were tired of running. Finally, here was a king who wanted to fight. Edmund fought 5 major battles against Cnut in a single season: Pen Selwood, Shurston, London, Brentford, Otford. He was a whirlwind. At Shurston, the fighting lasted 2 days. Legend says Edmund grew so frustrated that he threw away his shield, grabbed his sword with 2 hands, and hacked his way to the front of the line, searching for Cnut. He allegedly cut the head off a Danish soldier who looked like the king and held it up, screaming that the war was over, only to be told he'd killed the wrong guy. But Edmund had a problem. It wasn't Cnut. It was a man named Edric Striona. Edric Striona is the Judas of the 11th century. He was the ealdorman of Mercia, a man of slippery charm and zero moral compass. He had served Ethelred, then defected to Cnut, then, seeing Edmund winning, defected back to Edmund. Why Edmund took him back is a mystery. Perhaps he needed Edric's soldiers more than he needed his loyalty. It was a fatal miscalculation. The climax came in October, at a place called Assundun, Ashington, in Essex. Edmund had the advantage. He had Cnut retreating toward his ships. The English army was high on morale, chasing the Danes through the autumn mud. Edmund drew up his lines. He put his trust in the shield wall one last time. The battle began. The English were pushing hard. It looked like Cnut was going to be driven into the sea. And then, Edric Striona made his move. According to the Chronicle, Edric, commanding the Mercian contingent, began the flight with the Magan Saite, his troops, and so betrayed his royal lord and the whole people of England. He didn't just run, he opened a hole in the line. The Danes poured through. The English flank collapsed. It was a massacre. The flower of the English nobility was cut down in the twilight. Bishops, abbots, and old ealdormen who had served since the days of Edgar, all dead. Edmund Ironside was forced to flee the field under the cover of darkness, leaving the raven banner of the Danes flying over the corpses of his friends. But even then, Edmund didn't quit. He was preparing to raise another army in the forest of Dean. Cnut, realizing that this madman would fight until there was no one left alive in England, agreed to talk. They met on an island in the River Severn, near Deerhurst. It was a meeting of exhausted titans, Cnut, the young Danish warlord, and Edmund, the battered English hero. They exchanged gifts, they swore friendship, and they decided to slice the cake. The Treaty of Olney divided England. Edmund would keep Wessex, the south, the ancestral home. Cnut would take Mercia and the north. It was a return to the days of Alfred and Guthrum. The deal had a grim rider clause. Whoever lived longer would inherit the whole thing. Edmund Ironside was young and strong. He likely thought he had decades to prepare for the next round. He rode back to London, perhaps nursing his wounds, perhaps planning his revenge. He died on November 30th, 1016. He had been king for 7 months. The cause of death is, as usual, a mystery. The natural assumption is that he died of wounds sustained at Asundun, or the sheer exhaustion of fighting 5 battles in a summer. But the legends are darker. A persistent, gruesome story claims he was murdered while sitting on the privy, stabbed from below by an assassin hiding in the cesspit. A humiliating end for an Ironside. Whatever the truth, his death was the final bell. The English resistance evaporated. The Witan in London, looking at the empty throne and the Viking army parked outside, bowed their heads to the inevitable. They didn't have another Ironside. They had only the children of Ethelred, who were far away in Normandy. So, in 1017, the English accepted the reality. Cnut was crowned king of all England. The conquest was complete. The dynasty of Cerdic, of Alfred, of Athelstan was out of power. A Dane sat on the throne of Winchester. But here is the surprise. Everyone expected Cnut to be a tyrant. They expected him to loot the country and treat England like a slave colony. He had, after all, mutilated hostages and ravaged the land. But Cnut was a chameleon. The moment the crown touched his head, he stopped being a Viking raider and started being an Anglo-Saxon king. He married Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy. Yes, the same Emma who had fled with her sons. She came back and married the man who had effectively hounded her first husband to death. It was a cold, pragmatic political union. It legitimized Cnut. He married the queen. And it protected Emma. She was queen again. Cnut then dealt with the traitor, Edric Striona. Edric came to see Cnut, expecting a reward for his betrayal at Asundun. He likely smirked, thinking he would be the power behind the throne. Cnut looked at him. He knew that a man who betrays one king will betray another. Pay him what he is owed, Kinnut reportedly said. Depending on which story you believe, Edric was either axed on the spot in the palace or strangled and thrown out a window into the Thames. Either way, England breathed a collective sigh of relief. The traitor was gone, the wars were over, the fires were put out. Kinnut sent most of his fleet home to Denmark, paying them off with a massive tax of £72,000, plus another 10,500 from London. It was painful, but it was a severance package. The occupying army left. England settled into a strange, unfamiliar peace. It was part of a new empire now, a North Sea empire. Kinnut wasn't just King of England. He would soon be King of Denmark and Norway too. For the first time, the North Sea wasn't a barrier or a battlefield. It was a highway connecting a vast Scandinavian superstate. And Edmund Ironside. He was buried at Glastonbury, near his grandfather Edgar. He is the great what-if of English history. If he had lived, would the Normans ever have invaded? Would England have remained Saxon? We will never know. He flashes across the history books like a lightning bolt, brilliant, violent, and gone too soon. Now, the stage belongs to the Dane. Kinnut the Great is about to show the world that a Viking can be more English than the English themselves. There is a deep irony at the heart of the 11th century. For 300 years, the Anglo-Saxons had prayed to be delivered from the fury of the Northmen. They had bled, paid Danegeld, and built burhs to keep the Vikings out. And yet, when a Viking finally sat on the throne of England, it turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to the country. Knut the Great, or Canute, if you prefer the anglicized version, is one of history's greatest surprises. He came as a conqueror, red-handed with the mutilation of hostages, but he ruled as a statesman. He didn't treat England like a looted province. He treated it like the jewel in his crown. In fact, he liked England so much, he basically moved in. He spent more time in Winchester and London than he did in Denmark. He realized that the English machinery of government, the mints, the shires, the writs, was far more advanced than anything back in Scandinavia. So instead of smashing it, he oiled the gears. His first move was to send the army home. This was a massive gamble. A foreign king usually needs foreign swords to stay in power. But Canute kept only a small, elite bodyguard of 40 ships, the famous housecarls, and paid off the rest of the great army. He told them to go back to Denmark. By doing this, he lowered the taxes on the English people and showed them he trusted them not to stab him in the back. It worked. The English breathed a sigh of relief. He then divided the country into 4 great earldoms. This is a crucial shift in the political landscape. The old small shires were grouped into massive super-regions. Wessex he kept for himself initially, but he gave East Anglia to a tall, capable Dane named Thorkel the Tall. Mercia went to a local survivor named Leofric, and Northumbria went to Eric of Leithier. But there was a new face in the crowd, a man of obscure origins, possibly the son of a Sussex thegn named Godwin. Knut liked him. Godwin was sharp, ruthless, and incredibly capable. Knut made him Earl of Wessex. It was the beginning of the House of Godwin, a family that would eventually swallow the kingdom whole. Keep an eye on them. They are the future kings and kingmakers. Canut's genius was in his branding. He knew the English church viewed him as a barbarian antichrist. So he became the ultimate Christian pilgrim. He showered gold on the monasteries. He rebuilt the churches his father Sweyn had burned. In 1023. He pulled off a masterstroke of public relations. He decided to move the body of Saint Alphege. Alphege was the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had been murdered by Vikings, drunkenly pelted to death with ox bones, a decade earlier. His body was in London. Cnut organized a grand state procession to move the martyr's bones back to Canterbury. Cnut himself walked in the procession, helping to carry the coffin. Think about the optics. The Viking king carrying the bones of the victim of Viking violence. It was a profound apology. It said, "The past is dead. We are all Christians now." The English clergy loved him for it. They stopped calling him a wolf and started calling him a protector. And he was a protector, because Cnut was also King of Denmark from 1019 and King of Norway from 1028. The North Sea became a private lake. The Viking raids stopped instantly. Why would a Viking raid England when the King of England was also the King of the Vikings? It would be like robbing your own boss. For nearly 20 years, England enjoyed a profound golden peace. Trade boomed. Merchants could sail from York to Oslo without fear. This was the North Sea Empire. It was a loose federation held together by Cnut's personal charisma and his fleet. He was the Emperor of the North. In 1027, he traveled to Rome to attend the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor, Conrad II. He walked alongside the Emperor and the Pope, an equal among the great powers of Europe. He sent a letter back to the English people from Rome. It's a delightful document, basically saying, "I've just had a great chat with the Pope and the Emperor, and I've got them to agree to lower the tolls for English pilgrims. Also, I'm coming home soon, so make sure everyone pays their tithes, or else." It was the voice of a man in total control. Now, we have to address the waves. You know the story. Cnut sits his throne on the beach and commands the tide not to come in. The water, indifferent to royal commands, soaks his feet. Usually, this is told as a story of arrogance, a mad king thinking he is a god. But the earliest version of the story, written by Henry of Huntingdon, says the exact opposite. Cnut was fed up with his sycophantic courtiers telling him he was all-powerful. So, he staged a demonstration. He sat on the beach as the tide rose, and when he got wet, he turned to his courtiers and said, essentially, "See, the power of earthly kings is empty and worthless compared to the power of God, who commands heaven, earth, and sea." He then took off his golden crown and placed it on a crucifix in Winchester Cathedral, never wearing it again. It wasn't an act of hubris. It was an act of humility. It was a piece of political theater designed to show that he knew his place in the cosmos. He was a good king because he knew he wasn't God. But even good kings die. And when a king who holds together 3 kingdoms with his bare hands dies, things tend to fall apart. Cnut died in 1035. At the age of about 40, he was buried in Winchester, in the heart of the Saxon kingdom he had adopted. And almost immediately, the cracks appeared. The succession was a mess. Cnut had 2 sets of families. He had a first wife, or handfast partner, named Aelfgifu of Northampton. And he had his queen, Emma of Normandy. He had sons by both. His intended heir was Harthacnut, his son with Emma. Harthacnut was supposed to inherit both Denmark and England, but Harthacnut was stuck in Denmark, fighting off a rebellion by the Norwegians, led by the son of Saint Olaf. It's a small world. He couldn't get to England. Meanwhile, Cnut's other son, Harold Harefoot, son of Aelfgifu, was in England. He was called Harefoot, presumably because he was fast, or perhaps because he preferred hunting on foot. Harold looked at the empty throne and said, "I'll take it." The country split again. The earls took sides. Godwin and Queen Emma held Wessex for the absent Harthacnut. The northern earls supported Harold Harefoot. It was a standoff. Then a tragedy occurred that would poison relations for decades. While this standoff was happening, two other princes decided to visit. Alfred and Edward, the sons of Ethelred the Unready, and Emma, were still living in exile in Normandy. Hearing that their stepfather Knut was dead, they decided to come over and test the waters. It was a mistake. Alfred landed in England and was met by Earl Godwin. Godwin claimed to be escorting him to the king, but instead, Alfred was seized. His men were slaughtered. Alfred was taken to Ely, blinded, his eyes were gouged out, and died of the shock and infection. Who ordered this? Was it Harold Harefoot? Was it Godwin trying to curry favor with the new regime? The blame stuck to Godwin. From that day on, there was blood between the House of Godwin and the House of Wessex. The death of Alfred became a rallying cry. Harold Harefoot eventually seized the whole kingdom as Harthacnut stayed away too long. Harold ruled from 1035 to 1040. He is a forgettable king, mostly noted for dying young. When Harold died in 1040, Harthacnut finally arrived. He came with a massive fleet, ready to invade his own country. He was furious. He had Harold's body dug up, beheaded, and thrown into a fen, later retrieved and buried at St. Clement Danes. Harthacnut was a brutal, angry young man. He imposed a massive tax to pay for his fleet, which made him instantly hated. He punished the people of Worcester for refusing to pay by burning their city. But Harthacnut had one redeeming quality. He knew he was sick. He was likely suffering from tuberculosis, or perhaps the consequences of excessive drinking. He knew he wouldn't live long, and he had no children. So, in a surprising act of familial responsibility, he invited his surviving half-brother, Edward, the one still in Normandy, to come to court. In June 1042, Harthacnut was at a wedding feast in Lambeth. He stood up to drink a toast to the bride. As he raised the cup, he went into convulsions and collapsed. He died as he stood at his drink, the chronicle says. A fitting end, perhaps, for a Viking age that began with feasting and ended with it. With Harthacnut dead, the Danish line was extinguished. There were no more sons of Knut. The North Sea Empire dissolved like sea foam. Denmark went one way, Norway another. And England? England looked at the quiet, pious man standing in the corner. Edward, the son of Ethelred, the descendant of Alfred, the blood of Cerdic. The Witan didn't hesitate. They were tired of Danes. They were tired of taxes. They wanted the old days back. They proclaimed Edward king before Harthacnut was even buried. The exile had returned. The House of Wessex was restored. It felt like a miracle, a divine correction of history. But the Edward who walked into the palace at Winchester wasn't a Saxon warrior like his grandfather Edmund Ironside. He was a Normanized stranger. He spoke French better than English. He had grown up in the courts of dukes, not in the mead halls of earls. And watching him, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, was Earl Godwin. The man who had likely killed Edward's brother was now the most powerful man in Edward's kingdom. The tension in the room was palpable. The drama of the next 24 years, the drama that would lead directly to the catastrophe of Hastings, was about to begin. The confessor had arrived, but the sins of the past were waiting for him. The year is 1042, and England has a new king who feels like an old ghost. Edward, known to history as the Confessor, was roughly 40 years old when he took the crown. He had spent the last 25 years in Normandy, living in the castles of his mother's family, speaking French, surrounded by French monks and French knights. When he stepped onto the shingle at Sandwich, he looked like a Saxon. He had the long nose and the reddish blonde hair of the House of Wessex, but his mind was Norman. He found himself in a country he barely recognized. It was a land of earldoms dominated by powerful Danish Saxon warlords who were used to doing whatever they pleased. And the biggest, loudest, most dangerous of them all was Earl Godwin. Godwin was the Earl of Wessex, the man who owned more land than the king himself. He was the survivor of the Knut era, the man who had risen from obscurity to become the power behind the throne. But there was a dark stain between him and the new king. Everyone knew, or suspected, that Godwin had been complicit in the blinding and death of Edward's brother, Alfred, years earlier. Imagine the tension at the first royal council. The king sits on the throne, looking down at the man who killed his brother. Godwin stands there, smiling, professing his loyalty, and offering the king a magnificent golden ship as a welcome home gift. Edward took the ship, but he didn't take the hand. He needed Godwin. Godwin controlled the army and the treasury, but he hated him. To keep the peace, the Witan practically forced Edward to marry Godwin's daughter, Edith. It was a political match made in hell. Edith was beautiful, educated, and by all accounts, a lovely woman. The chroniclers famously wrote, Sicut spina rosum, genuit Godwinus Editham. As the thorn produces the rose, so Godwin produced Edith. But Edward treated her with a cold, distant politeness. And here lies the central mystery of the reign. The marriage produced no children. Was Edward celibate? Later hagiographies, written by monks who wanted to make him a saint, claimed he and Edith lived like brother and sister, preserving their virginity for God. This earned him the title Confessor. Oh, or was it something more human? Did Edward simply refuse to sleep with the daughter of his brother's murderer because he couldn't bear to create a grandson for Godwin? Or was he simply infertile? Whatever the reason, the royal bedroom was silent. And in a monarchy, a silent bedroom is a loud political crisis. Every year that passed without a child made the succession more uncertain. The vacuum began to open up. Edward tried to counter the power of the Godwins by bringing in his friends from Normandy. He gave lands to Norman knights. He made a Norman monk, Robert of Jumièges, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The English nobles grumbled. They complained that the king was surrounded by foreigners who whispered in his ear in a language they couldn't understand. The tension finally snapped in 1051. It started with a brawl in Dover. Count Eustace of Boulogne, Edward's brother-in-law, visited England. On his way home, his knights got into a fight with the townsfolk of Dover over lodgings. A riot broke out. People were killed. Eustace ran back to King Edward and complained. Edward, furious, ordered Godwin, since Dover was in Godwin's earldom, to go and punish the town, essentially to burn it. Godwin refused. He said the men of Dover had a right to a fair trial. He took a stand as the champion of English rights against the foreign favorites. It was open rebellion. Godwin raised an army. The king raised an army. They stared each other down across the River Severn. But civil war is bad for business, and the other earls mediated. In the end, Godwin lost his nerve. His army melted away. He and his sons, including the dashing, capable Harold, fled into exile. For a year, Edward was truly king. He banished Edith to a nunnery, petty but effective. He ruled without the shadow of the Earl. And it is in this brief window, the winter of 1051 to 52, that something fateful likely happened. William, the young Duke of Normandy, visited England. We don't have the minutes of the meeting, but William was Edward's cousin. Edward had no children. He was angry at the Godwins. It is almost certain that in a moment of gratitude and shared Norman heritage, Edward promised William the throne. "When I die," he might have said, "England is yours." William went home to Normandy, believing he had a golden ticket. But in 1052, the tide turned. Godwin returned. He didn't come begging. He came with a fleet. He sailed up the Thames, rallying the men of the south coast. The Londoners cheered him. The king's army refused to fight. Edward was forced to capitulate. It was a total humiliation for the king. The Norman bishop, Robert of Jumièges, fled for his life, riding so fast he supposedly left his pallium, his symbol of office, behind. Godwin was restored. Edith was brought back from the nunnery. The foreigners were kicked out. The House of Godwin had won. A few months later, Earl Godwin was dining with the king at Easter. The conversation turned, awkwardly, to the old scandal of Alfred's death. Godwin, dramatic to the end, supposedly held up a piece of bread and said, "May this crust choke me if I had any part in your brother's death." He ate it, collapsed, and died a few days later. A stroke, or divine judgment. The monks certainly thought it was the latter. With the old wolf dead, his son Harold Godwinson stepped up. Harold was different. He didn't have the dark baggage of his father. He was tall, incredibly strong, charming, and a brilliant soldier. He became the sub-Regulus, the under-king. For the last decade of Edward's reign, Edward was the spirit of the nation, but Harold was the sword. Edward withdrew more and more from the world. He became obsessed with a project on Thorney Island, a swampy patch of ground upriver from London. He wanted to build a great abbey dedicated to St. Peter. He poured the royal revenues into it. This was the beginning of Westminster Abbey. It wasn't the Gothic cathedral we see today. It was a massive Romanesque structure, heavy and solemn. While Edward prayed and supervised masons, Harold fought. In 1063, Harold launched a lightning campaign against the Welsh king Cruffyd ap Llywelyn. Harold showed a ruthlessness that terrified his enemies. He didn't just beat the Welsh, he hunted Cruffyd through the mountains, until the Welsh themselves turned on their king, cut off his head, and sent it to Harold. Harold was the golden boy. He was the effective ruler of England. But there was still the question of the promise. Had Edward promised the throne to William? Or as Harold grew more powerful, did Edward tacitly accept that Harold would succeed him? Then came the mysterious trip of 1064. Harold went to Normandy. Why? The Bayeux Tapestry shows him going, but it doesn't say why. Was he sent to confirm the promise to William? Was he shipwrecked by accident? Whatever the reason, Harold ended up as a guest, prisoner of Duke William. And there, at Bayeux, something happened that would haunt him. William made Harold swear an oath. The tapestry shows Harold touching two holy reliquaries. The Norman story says Harold swore to support William's claim to the English throne. Harold later claimed he was forced, making the oath invalid. But in the 11th century, breaking an oath sworn on relics was a radioactive sin. Harold returned to England, humiliated but alive. The year 1065 opened with a rumble of thunder. A rebellion broke out in the north. The Northumbrians had had enough of their earl, Harold's own brother, Tostig. Tostig was a hard man, a heavy taxer, and a strict enforcer of justice in a lawless land. The Northumbrians marched south, demanding Tostig be fired. Harold faced a choice: support his brother or support the stability of the kingdom. He chose the kingdom. He advised King Edward to accept the rebels' demands. Tostig was banished. He fled overseas, his heart black with hatred for Harold. The brotherly bond was severed. Harold had cleared the board of domestic threats, but he had created a monster who would return. Christmas 1065. King Edward was dying. He was in his palace at Westminster, listening to the chanting of the monks from his new, unfinished abbey. He was drifting in and out of a coma. On his deathbed, he had a vision. He saw two monks he had known in Normandy. They told him that because of the sins of the earls and the bishops, God was handing England over to the devil for a year and a day. It was the prophecy of the green tree, that England would be severed from its roots and not flourish again until it crafted itself back together. On January 5th, 1066, the confessor woke for the last time. The room was full. Harold was there. Queen Edith was there. Archbishop Stigand was there. According to the Vita Edwardi, the king stretched out his hand towards Harold and said, "I commend this woman and all the kingdom to your protection." It was a deathbed bequest. In Saxon law, a man's last words trumped any previous promise. If he gave the kingdom to Harold now, whatever he had said to William 20 years ago didn't matter. Edward died. They buried him the next morning in his new abbey. It was January 6th, Epiphany. The ground was hard with frost, and that very afternoon, in a rush that suggests a desperate anxiety, the Witan met and elected Harold king. Harold Godwinson was crowned Harold II. He was the first English king in centuries with no royal blood. He was a usurper to some, a hero to others. He sat on the throne, wearing the crown of the confessor, holding the scepter. But across the sea, in Normandy, Duke William was listening to a messenger. When he heard the news, it is said he sat on a bench for hours, covering his face with his cloak, speaking to no one. He was not grieving. He was calculating. And far to the north, in the frozen fjords of Norway, another king was listening. Harald Hardrada, the hard ruler, the last true Viking. And beside him stood Tostig, Harold's angry brother, whispering that England was ripe for the plucking. The year 1066 had begun. The board was set. The pious king was dead. Now, the wolves were coming to the funeral. The year 1066 is the most famous date in English history, but it didn't begin with a battle. It began with a star. In late April, shortly after Easter, a strange object appeared in the night sky. It was the Hairy Star, a trail of fire blazing across the heavens. We know it today as Halley's Comet. It visits our skies every 75 years, usually bringing wonder. But to the Anglo-Saxons, staring up from their muddy fields, it brought terror. It was a cosmic red flag. The monks of Malmesbury looked at it and wrote, "You have come, you source of tears to many mothers, you evil. I hate you. It is long since I saw you. But as I see you now, you are much more terrible. For I see you brandishing the downfall of my country." King Harold II didn't need a comet to tell him trouble was coming. He knew the wolves were circling. On the southern coast of England, he assembled the largest military mobilization in the history of the island. Every able-bodied man, every ship, every spear was gathered on the Isle of Wight and along the cliffs of Sussex. They were waiting for the wind. Across the Channel, Duke William of Normandy was also waiting. He had built a massive invasion fleet, but the summer winds were blowing from the north, pinning him in his harbors. For months, the two armies stared at each other across the grey water, separated only by the weather. It was a grueling, expensive staring contest. Harold had to feed thousands of men. As the summer dragged on into August and then September, the provisions ran out. The men of the Fyrd were farmers. They looked at the ripening wheat in the fields behind them and knew that if they didn't go home to harvest it, their families would starve in the winter. On September 8th, Harold made the heartbreaking decision. He disbanded the fleet. He sent the militia home. He rode back to London, praying that the autumn gales would protect the island where his ships could not. The coast was left undefended, but the blow didn't come from the south. It came from the north. While Harold was watching the Channel, a armada of 300 ships was sailing down the coast of Scotland. They were led by a man who was less a king and more a force of nature, Harold Hardrada. Hardrada means hard ruler. He was the king of Norway, but his resume read like an adventure novel. He had been exiled as a boy, traveled to Russia, and then to Constantinople, where he served as the commander of the Varangian Guard, the elite Viking bodyguards of the Byzantine emperors. He had fought in Sicily, in Bulgaria, in the Holy Land. He was reported to be 7 feet tall, a giant of a man with a mustache like a walrus and a thirst for war that could not be slaked. He was the last true Viking hero, a living relic of the age of Ragnar Lothbrok, and riding beside him was Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own brother. Tostig had sold his soul to the Norsemen for a chance at revenge. He promised Hardrada that England was divided, that the North loved him, and that Harold was a usurper. They landed in the Humber estuary in mid-September. The English earls of the North, Edwin and Morcar, tried to stop them at the Battle of Fulford on September 20th. It was a disaster. The young earls were outgeneraled by the veteran Hardrada. The English army was trapped in a marsh and butchered. The city of York, the capital of the North, surrendered. The Vikings didn't even bother to occupy the city. They were so confident, they camped at a place called Stamford Bridge, 7 miles away, waiting for hostages and supplies to be delivered to them. It was a sunny, relaxed picnic. Then, the impossible happened. King Harold, in London, heard the news of the landing. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wait to gather the slow-moving county levies. He took his elite housecarls, his professional bodyguards, and he marched. The march to Stamford Bridge is one of the greatest feats of endurance in military history. Harold moved his army 185 miles in 4 days. They marched day and night, sleeping in ditches, eating on the move, fueled by adrenaline and rage. They moved so fast, they outran the news of their own coming. On the morning of September 25th, the Vikings at Stamford Bridge were lounging in the meadows on the banks of the River Derwent. It was an unseasonably hot day. Because they felt safe. York had surrendered, after all. They had left their mailcoats back on the ships, miles away. They were wearing tunics. Some were swimming. Suddenly, a cloud of dust appeared on the ridge to the west. Then, the glint of steel. Hardrada looked at Tostig. "Is this the hostages from York?" "I think it is," Tostig said, hoping against hope. Then the English army crested the hill. rank after rank of shields and spears descending like a landslide. It wasn't hostages, it was the King of England. The Vikings were caught completely off guard. They were divided by the river. A small contingent was on the west bank. The main army was on the east. The English smashed into the west bank group, cutting them down in minutes. The survivors scrambled across the narrow wooden bridge to join their comrades. This brings us to the most cinematic moment of the battle. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that a single Viking warrior, a giant in full armor, held the bridge. He stood alone on the narrow planks, swinging a massive Dane axe. He killed 40 English soldiers. Arrows bounced off his shield. Spears couldn't reach him. He was a bottleneck of death, buying time for Hardrada to form his shield wall on the other side. The English couldn't get past him. Finally, an English soldier had a bright idea. He grabbed a half-barrel, or a small boat, floated under the bridge, and thrust a long spear up through the gaps in the planks. The spear pierced the giant in the groin. He fell, presumably in agony, and the English army poured across the river. But before the main clash, there was a moment of stillness. A lone rider rode out from the English lines. He approached the Viking shield wall. He called out for Tostig. "King Harold offers you peace," the rider said. "He offers you your earldom back and a third of the kingdom, if you will lay down your arms and return to him." Tostig, torn between ambition and brotherhood, asked, "And what does he offer my ally, King Harald Hardrada?" The rider looked at the 7-foot Norse giant standing nearby. "He offers him 7 feet of English ground." The rider replied coolly, "Or perhaps a little more, seeing as he is taller than most men." The rider rode away. Hardrada asked Tostig, "Who was that man who spoke so well?" "That," Tostig said quietly, "was my brother, King Harold. It was the last chance for peace. It was rejected. The battle began. It was a massacre. The Vikings, unarmored and surprised, fought with the ferocity of trapped animals. Hardrada went into a berserker rage, rushing ahead of his banners, hacking with a 2-handed sword. But an arrow struck him in the throat. The giant fell. Tostig took command. Harold offered peace again. Tostig refused. The fighting went on till Tostig, too, was slain. Then the king's reinforcements from the ships arrived, exhausted from running all the way from the fleet. They threw themselves into the fight, but they were too tired. As the sun set, the Viking army shattered. It was a total victory. Of the 300 ships that had arrived, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Harold had destroyed the greatest warrior of the age. He had saved his kingdom. He had proven that the English were not the unready victims of the past. They were the masters of their own house. Harold sat in York that night, presiding over a victory banquet. He was exhausted, battered, and grieving for the brother he had been forced to kill. But he was triumphant. The North was secure. The threat was over. The feast was interrupted. The doors of the hall banged open. A messenger, covered in mud and sweat, stumbled in. He had ridden from the south coast, killing horses in his haste. He knelt before the king. The room went silent. "My lord," the messenger gasped, "the wind has changed." While Harold was fighting for his life at Stamford Bridge, the northern wind that had pinned Duke William in Normandy had finally faltered. A southern breeze had sprung up. The Norman fleet had launched. "William the Bastard has landed at Pevensey," the messenger said. "He is burning the land." Harold looked at his commanders. His housecarls were battered. His archers were out of arrows. His army was 200 miles away from where it needed to be. They had just fought a battle that would have been the climax of any other century. But fate is cruel. It wasn't the climax. It was just the warm-up. Harold stood up. He didn't complain. He didn't despair. He simply gave the order. We marched south. The sun had set on the Viking Age. The last longship was sailing away. But a new, darker shadow was lengthening across the Sussex Downs. The Normans were here, and on a hill called Senlac, near a town called Hastings, the final act of Anglo-Saxon England was waiting to begin. Harold Godwinson did not stop to rest. He rode into London on roughly the 6th of October, leaving his exhausted infantry to straggle in behind him. His face was gaunt, his armor stained with the mud of Stamford Bridge. He had saved the north, but now the south was burning. In London, the voices of caution tried to slow him down. His brother, Gurth, one of the few family members left who wasn't dead or a traitor, begged him to wait. "You are tired," Gurth argued. "Let me lead the army south. I swore no oath to William. I can fight him with a clean conscience. You stay here, burn the countryside, starve him out." It was sound military advice. William was trapped on a peninsula. If Harold had waited a week, he could have gathered the full might of England, 30,000 men, and crushed the Normans with sheer weight. But Harold was a king who had won his crown by action. He was angry. He had seen reports of the Normans burning Sussex villages, his personal estates. He couldn't sit in London while his people bled. He stayed in the city only long enough to pray at the altar of his new abbey at Waltham. Legend says that as he knelt, the head of the Christ figure on the crucifix bowed down in sorrow, as if knowing what was to come. Harold stood up, put on his helmet, and ordered the march. They arrived at the assembly point on the evening of Friday, the 13th of October. The location was a ridge known as Senlac Hill. The name is likely a Norman corruption of the Old English sand lacu, meaning sand lake, perhaps referring to a stream that ran red with iron ore, or soon with blood. The English army took the high ground. This was the strategy. They formed a shield wall along the ridge, packed so tight that a dead man could not fall. They were a forest of spears and axes. In the center stood Harold beneath his two banners, the Dragon of Wessex, a beast of red gold, and the Fighting Man, a figure of a warrior embroidered in gems. Opposite them, in the valley below, William of Normandy was preparing his gamble. He wore around his neck a bag of holy relics, the very bones Harold had sworn his oath upon. He flew a banner blessed by the Pope himself. He had turned a territorial dispute into a crusade. The sun rose on Saturday, October 14th, 1066. It was a crisp autumn morning. At 9 a.m., the trumpet sounded. "Dieu aide! God aid us!" cried the Normans. "Ut, ut! Out, out!" roared the Saxons. The battle opened with a surreal duel of technologies. The Norman archers walked up the hill and loosed a volley. But they were shooting uphill. The arrows either stuck harmlessly in the Saxon shields or flew over their heads. The English jeered. They banged their weapons against their shields, a cacophony of drumming that rolled down the hill like thunder. Then came the infantry. William sent his foot soldiers up the slope. They were met by the English great axe, the Danish axe, a two-handed nightmare that could cleave a man and his horse in a single swing. The Normans were smashed backward. Then came the cavalry. This was the Norman's secret weapon, knights on heavy chargers. But horses are not tanks. They won't charge into a solid wall of wood and iron. The Saxon wall held. The horses shied away, rearing and slipping on the grassy slope. The English threw javelins, rocks, and even axes meant for throwing into the milling confusion. By noon, the Normans were in trouble. A rumor ripped through their lines. The Duke is dead. William has fallen. Panic, the greatest killer in ancient warfare, set in. The Norman left flank broke and ran down the hill. This was the moment. The English right flank, seeing the enemy flee, lost their discipline. They broke the shield wall and charged down the hill, screaming for blood. They trapped the Normans in a marshy gully and slaughtered them. It looked like victory, but William wasn't dead. He tore off his helmet, riding amidst his terrified men with his face bare, roaring, "Look at me, I am alive, and by the grace of God I will conquer." Seeing the English exposed in the valley, William wheeled his cavalry around. The pursuers became the pursued. Caught in the open, without the protection of the shield wall, the English were cut down by the knights. Harold watched from the ridge, helpless to stop the folly. He closed the gaps in the line, but the wall was shorter now, thinner. The battleground on into the afternoon. It became a slugging match. The Normans charged, were repulsed, regrouped, and charged again. Then, William used a tactic that historians still debate: the feigned retreat. He ordered his men to pretend to run away. The English, thinking, "We've got them this time," broke ranks again to chase. The Normans wheeled around and butchered them. It happened twice, maybe 3 times. The discipline that had made the English army the terror of the Viking world was unraveling. The shield wall, once a solid fortress, was now a series of desperate knots of men fighting back to back. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, William changed his archers' tactics. "Don't shoot at the men," he ordered. "Shoot at the sky." The arrows fell like hail, dropping vertically onto the heads of the English behind the wall. Men looked up in horror and were blinded. And then the king fell. The Bayeux tapestry shows a figure clutching an arrow in his eye. Is it Harold, or is Harold, the figure next to him, being hacked down by a knight? The sources conflict. The Song of the Battle of Hastings says 4 knights broke through and butchered him. 1 pierced his chest, 1 cut off his head, and 1, shamefully, hacked off his leg. It doesn't matter how the light went out. It only matters that it did. The fighting man banner fell into the mud. The dragon was trampled. Gurth was dead. Leofwine, Harold's other brother, was dead. The House of Godwin was extinguished in a single afternoon. The remaining housecarls, the elite guard who had marched from York to Sussex, fought to the last man around the body of their king. They did not ask for quarter, and none was given. As darkness fell, the English army dissolved into the woods of the Weald. The Normans were too exhausted to pursue far. They camped on the field among the thousands of bodies. William, the bastard, no more, but now the conqueror, sat down to eat his dinner surrounded by the carnage. The next day, the women came to the field. Edith Swan, Neck, Harold's handfast wife, and the love of his life, before he made a political marriage to the sister of the northern earls, walked through the gore. The king's body was so mangled it was unrecognizable. Edith identified him only by secret marks on his body that only she knew. William refused to give Harold a Christian burial. He guarded the coast with such zeal. William sneered. "Let him be buried on the cliff, so he can guard it still. And so ended the Anglo-Saxon monarchy. It wasn't just a change of management, it was an amputation. The English aristocracy was wiped out. Within 20 years, almost every major estate, every bishopric, and every earldom was held by a Norman. The language of power shifted from the guttural, poetic Old English to the nasal, legalistic Old French. The wooden halls were torn down, and the stone castles, the Tower of London, Dover, Colchester, rose up like prison bars across the landscape. The English became second-class citizens in their own land. It would take 3 centuries for the two languages to merge and create the English we speak today. But the Saxons didn't disappear. They went into the soil. They remained the ploughmen, the smiths, the mothers, and the memory of the land. The laws of Alfred, the piety of the confessor, the stubbornness of the Ironside. These things went underground, like roots in winter, waiting for a spring that would not come for a long, long time. If you stand on Senlac Hill today, there is an abbey there, Battle Abbey. The high altar marks the spot where Harold fell. It is a quiet place now. The sheep graze on the slope where the shield wall stood. The sand lake is just a trickle of water, but listen closely to the wind in the ruins. You might hear the echo of a poem, the rhythm of the scop, the beat of a drum. It is the heartbeat of a lost world, a world of gold and garnets, of riddles and dragons, of warrior kings who stood in the shield wall and defied the turning of the tide. The sun has set. The long narrative is done. The book is closed. I hope you found some peace in this story, some rest in the long, winding road of history. It's been a journey from the first misty landing of Hengist to the final, bloody sunset at Hastings. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the past, please do leave a like and subscribe. And as always, sleep well.